The stagecoach door swung open and Eleanor Hayes stepped into the California dust with a worn carpet bag and a heart full of desperate hope. She'd traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man she'd never met, leaving behind nothing but shame and empty cupboards. But the platform stood silent. No groom waited, no welcoming smile, just miners staring and a station master who wouldn't meet her eyes. When she finally heard the truth, he married someone else 3 days ago, the ground didn't swallow her whole, though she wished it would. Some betrayals arrive quietly, wearing the face of a stranger's pity. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story, please hit that like button and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales travel. Now, let's step back to where it all began. The journey from Philadelphia to Silver Ridge had taken Eleanor Hayes 23 days, 4 different rail lines, 2 riverboats, and finally, a bone-rattling stagecoach that seemed determined to shake every tooth from her head. She'd clutched the same letter for all 23 of those days, reading it so many times the paper had grown soft as fabric, the ink beginning to blur at the creases. Dear Miss Hayes, your inquiry regarding matrimonial correspondence has reached me with great interest. I am a businessman of 32 years, established in the mining trade in Silver Ridge, California. I seek a wife of good character and practical nature. If you are willing to journey west, I will provide passage funds and a modest home. I am told I am fair in appearance and temperament, neither given to drink nor gambling. Write with your answer, and if it pleases you to accept, I shall arrange everything. Respectfully, Mr. James Whitmore. It wasn't a love letter. Eleanor had known that from the first reading, but it was something potentially more valuable. It was an escape. An escape from the Philadelphia boarding house where she'd been living since her father's debts had swallowed their home whole. An escape from the whispers that followed her everywhere after she'd broken her engagement to Robert Dalton, the banker's son who'd proven himself to be a liar, and worse. An escape from the pitying looks of former friends who could no longer afford to associate with a woman whose reputation had been tarnished and whose pockets were empty. So she'd written back. And James Whitmore had written again, 3 more times over the course of 4 months. The letters were cordial, factual, discussing the weather and the growth of Silver Ridge and the price of silver ore. He'd sent a tintype photograph, a stern-faced man with dark hair and a stiff collar, standing beside what appeared to be a mining office. He looked respectable. That was enough. He'd sent money for passage. That was more than enough. Eleanor had packed everything she owned into 2 bags, sold what wouldn't fit, and boarded the first train west with a spine made straight by equal parts hope and terror. She was 24 years old, considered a spinster by Philadelphia standards, and she was traveling alone to marry a stranger. Her mother would have fainted, but her mother had been dead for 6 years, and her father had followed 18 months ago, leaving Eleanor with nothing but his debts and a tarnished name. The West was supposed to be different. The West was supposed to be a place where a person's past didn't matter as much as their willingness to work, where being poor wasn't a social death sentence, where a woman could start over. The stagecoach had arrived in Silver Ridge just after 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, when the California sun turned the dust to gold and made the ramshackle buildings shimmer like a mirage. Eleanor had pressed her face to the window, searching the small crowd gathered at the station for James Whitmore's face. She'd studied that tintype so many times she was certain she'd recognize him instantly. But when the coach lurched to a stop and the driver climbed down to open the door, Eleanor scanned the waiting faces and found no match. Just miners in dirt-stained clothes, a few women in faded calico, and a station master who was already turning away to help unload the luggage. "Miss?" The driver offered his hand. "Watch your step now." Eleanor descended carefully, her traveling dress, her best dress, carefully brushed and pressed that morning, already filmed with dust. The air smelled of horses and wood smoke and something sharp and mineral that she would later learn was the scent of crushed rock from the silver mines. The sun was blinding after the dim interior of the coach. "Excuse me." Eleanor approached the station master, a balding man with suspicious eyes and tobacco-stained whiskers. "I'm looking for Mr. James Whitmore. He was supposed to meet me here." The man's expression shifted. Something that might have been recognition, might have been discomfort. He glanced away. "Whitmore, you said?" "Yes. James Whitmore. I have a letter. Eleanor fumbled in her reticule, pulling out the latest correspondence. He arranged for me to come from Philadelphia. We're to be married. The station master's face went carefully blank. I see. Do you know him? Where might I find him? Miss, I think... He stopped, seemed to reconsider. You'd best talk to someone at the mining office. It's 2 blocks down. Can't miss it. Big sign out front. Something in his tone made Eleanor's chest tighten. Is something wrong? Not for me to say, miss. Mining office. They'll sort you out. He turned away before Eleanor could press further, busying himself with the luggage. The other passengers, a merchant and his wife, 2 miners, and a gambler in a dusty suit, had already dispersed into the town. Eleanor stood alone on the platform with her 2 bags, suddenly aware of every eye on her. The women were staring, the miners were staring, and not one of them looked friendly. Silver Ridge was smaller than Eleanor had imagined. One main street, unpaved and rutted with wagon tracks, lined with rough-hewn buildings that seemed to have been thrown up in a hurry and never reconsidered. A general store, a saloon already loud despite the early hour, a blacksmith shop, a building that might have been a hotel, and various other establishments whose purposes were unclear. Everything was the same sun-bleached gray-brown, covered in dust that swirled with every breeze. Eleanor picked up her bags, 1 in each hand, heavy with everything she owned, and started walking. 2 blocks down. Mining office. Her corset felt too tight, making it hard to breathe, and sweat was already gathering at her temples beneath her bonnet. The street was crowded with men, most of them stopping to stare as she passed. Some tipped their hats, others just looked, their gazes ranging from curious to calculating. She kept her eyes forward and her chin up the way her mother had taught her. A lady never shows fear or uncertainty, Eleanor. Confidence is armor. The mining office was indeed impossible to miss, a 2-story building that was actually painted, a faded green with white trim, and a large sign reading Silver Ridge Mining Company, Whitmore and Boone, proprietors. Whitmore. That was James's name. Relief flooded through Eleanor, loosening the knot in her chest. At least she'd found the right place. She climbed the steps to the porch, set down her bags, and opened the door. The interior was dim after the brilliant sunshine, and Eleanor paused in the doorway, blinking. A small front office with a desk, filing cabinets, a map of mining claims on one wall. And behind the desk, a woman looked up with startled eyes. Can I help you? She was perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled back severely and a dress that had been mended more than once. Pretty, despite the hard line of her mouth. I'm here to see Mr. James Whitmore, Eleanor said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. I'm Eleanor Hayes. He's expecting me. The woman's expression changed instantly, surprise melting into something that looked almost like pity. She stood quickly, smoothing her skirts. Miss Hayes, you'd better come in. Please, sit down. I don't need to sit. I just need to know where I can find Mr. Whitmore. Please, the woman insisted, gesturing to a chair. Sit. The knot in Eleanor's chest returned, tighter than before. She moved slowly to the chair but didn't sit. What's wrong? Has something happened to him? Not exactly. Oui. The woman twisted her hands together, clearly struggling with what to say. I'm Clara Boone. My brother Reed and Mr. Whitmore are business partners. Miss Hayes, I don't know how to... Did you come from back east? Philadelphia. Mr. Whitmore arranged for me to come. We're engaged to be married. The wedding was supposed to be this week. Eleanor heard her own voice rising and forced it back down. Please just tell me what's wrong. Clara Boone closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering courage. When she opened them again, they were full of genuine distress. Miss Hayes, I'm so very sorry. James Whitmore got married 4 days ago, to Sarah Cunningham, the banker's daughter. I believe there's been a terrible mistake. The words didn't make sense at first. Eleanor heard them individually. Married, 4 days, mistake, but they wouldn't arrange themselves into meaning. I don't understand. We had an agreement. He sent money for my passage. I have his letters. I know. I believe you. But he... Clara stopped, started again. Mr. Whitmore met Miss Cunningham 2 months ago when her father came to discuss financing for the mine. There was a courtship. A quick one. My brother tried to convince him to wait, to at least write to you and explain, but James said—" She stopped again, clearly editing herself. "He said you'd understand. That it was just a business arrangement anyway." Just a business arrangement. Eleanor felt something crack inside her chest, a fissure opening up through all the carefully constructed hope she'd been carrying. "A business arrangement," she repeated slowly. "I sold everything I owned. I traveled across the country. I left my home." "I know. Miss Hayes, please sit down. You look— Where is he?" The words came out hard, sharp-edged. "Where is Mr. Whitmore now?" "He and his wife left this morning for San Francisco. A wedding trip. They'll be gone 2 weeks." How convenient. Clara flinched at the bitterness in Eleanor's tone. "My brother didn't know about you until after the wedding. James never told him about the arrangement. When Reed found your letter in the office yesterday, he's been trying to figure out how to reach you, to warn you, but there wasn't time. The stage schedule." Eleanor finally sat down, not because she wanted to, but because her legs had stopped supporting her weight. The chair was hard beneath her, solid and real, while everything else seemed to be dissolving into unreality. "So there's no wedding, no home, no husband." "I'm afraid not." "And he knew I was coming." Clara's silence was answer enough. Eleanor looked down at her hands, still gloved in Philadelphia lace, now grimy with travel dust. She'd been so careful with these gloves, trying to make them last. She'd imagined arriving fresh and presentable. Imagined James Whitmore seeing her for the first time and being pleased with his choice. She'd imagined a small wedding, a modest home, a life built on mutual respect, if not love. She'd imagined safety. "Miss Hayes?" Claire's voice was gentle. "Do you have any money? For lodging or for passage back east?" Eleanor did the calculation in her head. After purchasing supplies for the journey and paying various fees and tips along the way, she had $12.38 left. It had cost $85 to get here. "Not enough," she said quietly. "Not nearly enough." "I see." Clara was quiet for a moment. "The hotel here, it's not a proper place for a lady alone. Too many minors, too much drinking. There's a boarding house, but what? Mrs. Thornton, who runs it, is particular about who she takes in, and word travels fast in a town this size. If she's heard you came as a mail-order bride who got left at the station—" Clara didn't finish, but she didn't have to. Eleanor understood. Her reputation in Philadelphia had been damaged by circumstances beyond her control. Apparently she'd traveled 2,000 miles only to have it happen again. "Then what do I do?" Eleanor heard the desperation creeping into her voice and hated it, but she couldn't seem to stop it. "Where do I go?" "Let me talk to my brother, Reed. He's a good man. He'll help figure something out." Clara moved toward the door. "Please wait here. I'll be right back." She disappeared through a door at the back of the office, and Eleanor heard low voices, Clara's urgent explanation, a man's deeper tones responding. Eleanor sat in the chair, her hands folded in her lap, and tried to process what had just happened. She was stranded. In a mining town she'd never heard of until 4 months ago, with $12 to her name, no place to stay, no way to get home. And the man who had orchestrated this disaster was comfortably married to someone else, probably congratulating himself on his clever resolution of an awkward situation. The rage came then, sudden and fierce, cutting through the shock. James Whitmore had used her desperation against her. He'd made promises he never intended to keep, taken her money and her hope, and discarded her like a broken tool. And he'd left town so he wouldn't have to face the consequences. The back door opened again, and Clara returned with a man who could only be her brother. Reed Boone was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and light brown hair that looked like it had been cut with a knife. He wore work clothes, denim pants, a simple cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, boots caked with the same dust that covered everything in Silver Ridge. He wasn't handsome in any conventional sense. His face was too weathered, his nose slightly crooked as if it had been broken and healed without proper setting, but there was something solid about him, something that suggested reliability. He looked at Eleanor with frank assessment in his gray eyes, and she felt herself being measured. Then he nodded, as if she'd passed some test she hadn't known she was taking. "Miss Hayes?" His voice was low, rough-edged, but not unkind. "I'm Reed Boone. I want to apologize for my partner's behavior. It was dishonorable. And if I'd known about the arrangement, I would have stopped it. Would you have? Eleanor met his gaze directly. Or would you have convinced yourself it was just business? Something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe respect. I'd have stopped it, he said firmly. And I'd have made him write to you himself, explain properly, send money for your return. What he did was cowardly. Cowardly is generous. I'd call it cruel. That too. Reed pulled over another chair and sat down, his long legs stretched in front of him. He moved like someone who was used to physical labor, economical and unhurried. Clara says you don't have money for passage back east. No. $12 won't get you far, certainly not to Philadelphia. He was quiet for a moment, thinking. The partnership. Whitmore and I split profits 50-50, which means half the funds in our account are mine to dispose of. I can give you $85 from my share, enough to get you home. Eleanor stared at him. Why would you do that? It's not your debt. It's not a debt. It's restitution. James owes you at least that much, and since he's too yellow to pay it himself, I'll pay it for him. I'm not a charity case. Didn't say you were. Reed's expression remained neutral. But facts are facts, Miss Hayes. You got wronged. Someone needs to make it right. I'm the only one here in a position to do it. It was a practical solution, a generous one. And Eleanor should have been grateful, but gratitude wasn't what she felt. What she felt was a deep, burning humiliation that apparently showed on her face, because Clara moved closer and put a hand on her shoulder. Miss Hayes, please don't think. We don't pity you. Reed just wants to help. Everyone pities me, Eleanor said flatly. I could see it on the station master's face, on yours, on the faces of every person who watched me walk down the street, the mail-order bride who wasn't wanted. That's what I am now. That's what everyone will call me. Reed leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Let them call you whatever they want. You know who you are. That's what matters. And who am I, Mr. Boone? Because right now, I don't seem to know. He studied her for a long moment. You're someone who had the courage to come west alone. Someone who took a risk on a new life. That takes guts. The rest, that's just bad luck and another man's character flaws. Eleanor wanted to believe him. She wanted to accept the money and book passage on the next stage and leave Silver Ridge in the dust. But something stopped her. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness, maybe just the bone-deep exhaustion of running from one disaster to another. I can't take your money, Mr. Boone. Why not? Because I didn't earn it. Because it's charity, no matter what you call it. Because... She stopped, surprised by the truth that emerged. Because if I leave now, it means James Whitmore wins. He gets to go on with his life, marry his banker's daughter, and forget I exist. While I slink back to Philadelphia with my tail between my legs, another failure added to my list. Reed's expression shifted, something like approval warming his eyes. So what do you want to do? I want to stay. I want to work. I want to earn the money for passage myself. Eleanor straightened in her chair, feeling the steel returning to her spine. Is there work available? Honest work? Clara and Reed exchanged a glance. It was Clara who spoke. I run an eating house on the edge of town. Nothing fancy. I serve meals to miners, mostly. Breakfast and supper. It's hard work, long hours, and the pay isn't much. But I could use help. My last girl left to get married last month, and I've been managing alone. What does it pay? $2 a week, plus meals and a place to sleep. There's a small room off the kitchen. It's clean, but not much else. Eleanor did the calculation quickly. At $2 a week, it would take her more than 10 months to earn enough for passage home. 10 months in Silver Ridge, serving meals to miners, living in a room off a kitchen. 10 months of being the woman James Whitmore had rejected. She should have said no. She should have swallowed her pride and taken Reed Boone's money and left on the next stage. Instead, she heard herself say, "When can I start?" Clara's face broke into a relieved smile. "Tonight, if you're willing, supper service starts at 5. "I'm willing." Reed stood, extending his hand. Eleanor took it, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip. "Welcome to Silver Ridge, Miss Hayes. For whatever it's worth, I think you're making a mistake. But I respect your reasons." Why do you think it's a mistake? Because this town chews up people and spits them out. It's loud, dirty, dangerous, and full of men who've forgotten how to behave around decent women. It's no place for someone like you. Someone like me, Eleanor repeated. You don't know anything about me, Mr. Boone. I know you're educated. I know you're from the East. I know you've probably never worked a day of manual labor in your life. He released her hand. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you'll surprise me. Maybe I will. They held each other's gaze for a moment longer, and Eleanor felt something pass between them. Not attraction exactly, though there was that too if she was honest, but more a sense of mutual recognition. Reed Boone saw her clearly, saw her strengths and her foolishness both, and he wasn't trying to manage or manipulate her. He was just telling the truth as he saw it. Clara broke the moment by picking up one of Eleanor's bags. Come on then, let's get you settled. You can wash up and rest for a bit before service starts. Reed, can you bring her other bag? They walked out together, leaving the mining office behind. Silver Ridge's main street was even busier now, the saloons filling up as the day shift ended and miners came up from the darkness below ground. Eleanor walked between Clara and Reed, very aware of the stares, the whispers that followed them. She kept her eyes forward and her spine straight. Clara's eating house was at the far end of town, a simple building with a hand-painted sign reading, "Good food, fair prices." The interior was clean if Spartan, long tables with benches, a serving counter, and the smell of something cooking that made Eleanor's empty stomach clench with hunger. She hadn't eaten since dawn. Kitchen's through here. Clara led the way through a doorway hung with a cloth curtain. The kitchen was larger than Eleanor expected, with a massive stove, prep tables, shelves of supplies, and windows that were open to catch the breeze. Another door led to a small room containing a narrow bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and nothing else. But the bed had clean sheets, the window had a curtain, and there was a lock on the door. It's not much, Clara said apologetically. It's perfect. And Eleanor meant it. This room was hers. She'd earned the right to be here by refusing to run. That made it worth more than any grand bedroom in Philadelphia. Reed set down her bag and touched his hat brim. I'll leave you ladies to it. Miss Hayes, if you need anything, if anyone bothers you, you come find me. The mining office or the Silver Ridge Saloon. I'm usually at one or the other. Thank you, Mr. Boone. He paused in the doorway, looking back. Call me Reed. We don't stand on ceremony much out here. Then call me Eleanor. He nodded and was gone, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Clara immediately began explaining the routine, where supplies were kept, how Eleanor should dress, simple work clothes, hair covered, what the miners expected, hot food, quick service, no flirtation. Eleanor listened carefully, committing it all to memory, while a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that she'd just made a terrible mistake. She told the voice to be quiet. She'd made her choice. Now she'd live with it. At 4:30, Clara handed her an apron. At 5 o'clock, the first miners came through the door, and Eleanor began her new life in Silver Ridge. The work was exactly as hard as Clara had warned. The miners came in waves, hungry, loud, smelling of sweat and rock dust and tobacco. Eleanor carried plates of beef stew and cornbread, poured coffee, cleared tables, and tried not to flinch when rough hands reached too close or rough voices called too familiarly. Some of the men were respectful, tipping their hats and saying, "Thank you, miss." Others were less so, their eyes lingering where they shouldn't, their comments making Clara's mouth tighten with disapproval. By 8 o'clock, when the last miner finally left and Clara locked the door, Eleanor's feet were screaming, her back ached, and she had burns on both forearms from brushing against hot pots. Her dress was soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air, and her hair had escaped its pins entirely. Clara looked at her with concern. "First day's always the worst. You should rest." "I need to help clean up." "I've got it. Go on now." Eleanor was too exhausted to argue. She stumbled to her small room, barely managing to remove her boots before collapsing onto the bed. She should wash. She should unpack. She should write to... But there was no one to write to. No one in Philadelphia who would care that she was here, that she'd been abandoned, that she was working as a serving girl in a mining town. She was completely alone. The tears came then, hot and bitter, soaking into the pillow that smelled like lye soap and sun. Eleanor cried for the future she'd lost, for the humiliation she'd endured, for the exhaustion in her bones, and the fear in her heart. She cried for her father's debts and her broken engagement and every choice that had led her to this small room at the edge of the world. But when the tears finally stopped, something had shifted. The grief was still there, but underneath it was something harder, something that felt almost like resolve. James Whitmore thought she would fail. Probably hoped she would, so he wouldn't have to feel guilty about what he'd done. The whole town probably expected her to give up, take Reed Boone's charity money, and disappear. Eleanor rolled onto her back, staring at the rough ceiling boards. In the distance, she could hear music from the saloons, laughter and shouting, and the general chaos of Silver Ridge settling in for the night. Tomorrow, she'd wake up sore and tired and do it all again. And the day after that. And the day after that. However long it took to earn her passage home. And maybe, just maybe, she'd prove everyone wrong in the process. Outside her window, the California stars were coming out, brighter than they ever appeared in Philadelphia. Eleanor watched them through the thin curtain and tried to believe that being here, in this place, at this moment, was somehow part of a plan she couldn't yet understand. It didn't feel like a plan. It felt like chaos. But she'd survived chaos before. She could do it again. Eleanor woke before dawn to the sound of roosters crowing and the distant clang of the stamp mill starting its daily rhythm. For a confused moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was wrong, the sounds were wrong, the quality of light coming through the window was all wrong. Then memory crashed back, and with it, the bone-deep ache in every muscle of her body. She forced herself upright, biting back a groan. Her feet were blistered inside her stockings. Her shoulders felt like they'd been beaten with a board, and her hands were raw from scrubbing dishes in water so hot it had left her skin pink and tender. This was only her second day. Through the thin wall, she could hear Clara already moving in the kitchen, the clatter of pots and the creak of the stove door. Eleanor splashed cold water on her face from the basin, twisted her hair into a severe knot, and pulled on the same dress from yesterday, her only work dress until she could afford fabric to make another. The mirror above the washstand showed a woman she barely recognized, hollow-eyed, pale, despite yesterday's sun, with a set to her jaw that looked almost desperate. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection. "One day at a time." The kitchen was warm and fragrant with coffee and frying bacon. Claire looked up from the stove, taking in Eleanor's careful movements. "How are you feeling?" "Like I was trampled by horses." Clara's mouth quirked. "That's about right for day 2. It gets easier. Here." She poured coffee into a chipped mug and pushed it across the work table. "Drink that. We've got 20 miners coming for breakfast, and they'll be here in 30 minutes. Eleanor wrapped her hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into her aching fingers. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, bitter and hot, and it went down like liquid courage. "What do you need me to do?" They fell into the rhythm Clara had taught her the previous evening. Eleanor slicing bread while Clara cooked eggs and bacon, setting out plates and cutlery, filling water pitchers. The work was methodical, almost meditative, and Eleanor found herself settling into it despite her exhaustion. There was something satisfying about completing tasks, seeing the tables transform from empty wood to settings ready for hungry men. The miners began arriving just after 6, stamping in with their lunch pails and tired faces, most of them heading underground for the morning shift. They were quieter at breakfast than they'd been at supper, focused on eating quickly and getting to work. Eleanor moved between tables, pouring coffee and clearing plates, and gradually became aware that some of them were watching her with an odd mixture of curiosity and something that might have been respect. One older man with a grizzled beard finally spoke as she refilled his cup. "You're the one came out to marry Whitmore, ain't you?" Eleanor's hand remained steady on the coffee pot. "I am. Heard he married the banker's daughter instead. Left you standing at the station." "That's correct." The miner shook his head slowly. "That's a damn shame, pardon my language. You come all this way just to get left high and dry. Most women would have hightailed it back east on the next stage." "I'm not most women." Something that might have been approval crossed his weathered face. "I can see that. Name's Thomas Grant. Been mining these hills 20 years. You need anything, miss? What's your name?" "Eleanor Hayes." "Miss Hayes, you need anything? You let old Tom know. Any man gives you trouble, I'll have words with him." "Thank you, Mr. Grant." He nodded and returned to his breakfast, but Eleanor felt the shift in the room. Other miners were nodding too, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. She'd been tested somehow and apparently passed. The knowledge warmed her almost as much as the coffee. By 8 o'clock, the breakfast crowd had cleared out, leaving Eleanor and Clara to tackle the mountain of dishes. They worked side by side at the big sink, Clara washing while Eleanor dried, and for a while neither spoke. Then Clara said quietly, "They're talking about you." I noticed. Not bad talk, respectful talk mostly. They think you've got sand staying here instead of running home. Sand? Eleanor tested the word. Is that good? In a mining town, it's the highest compliment. Clara handed her a dripping plate. But Eleanor, I need to tell you something about Reed. Eleanor's hand stilled on the dish towel. What about him? He and James, they've been partners for 3 years. Good partners, generally. They're not friends exactly, but they work well together. James handles the business side, the finances, and the investors. Reed handles the actual mining, the equipment, and the men. It's a good arrangement. Clara paused, choosing her words carefully. But Reed's been furious since he found out what James did. They had words yesterday before James left for San Francisco. Bad words. I don't want to cause problems between business partners. You're not causing anything. James caused this. But I wanted you to know Reed's the kind of man who takes responsibility seriously. He feels like he should have known what James was planning, should have stopped it somehow. He's going to try to help you, whether you want him to or not. I don't need help. I know, but he doesn't see it that way. Clara's expression was troubled. Just be patient with him. He means well, even when he's being overbearing. As if summoned by the conversation, heavy footsteps sounded on the porch, and Reed Boone pushed through the door. He was dressed for work, rough clothes and boots, a battered hat in his hands, but he'd clearly made an effort to clean up, his face freshly shaved and his hair damp. Morning. His gray eyes went straight to Eleanor, assessing. How's the work treating you? Well enough? Clara running you ragged? I'm managing fine, thank you. He studied her for a moment longer, and Eleanor had the unsettling feeling that he could see straight through her careful composure to the exhaustion and doubt underneath. But all he said was, "Good. That's good." He turned to his sister. "Clara, I need to talk to you about the supply order." While they discussed flour and coffee and side bacon, Eleanor finished the dishes and began preparing vegetables for the evening meal. She was aware of Reed's presence even with her back turned, aware of his deep voice rumbling through explanations about inventory and costs. He had a way of standing that suggested he took up more space than he actually did, a kind of quiet authority that made other people instinctively defer. When he finally left, promising to return later, Clara let out a long breath. See what I mean? He seems responsible. He's that and more, but Eleanor, Clara hesitated. Reed's had a hard time of it. His wife died 4 years ago, childbirth fever. He's been alone ever since, just throwing himself into the mine work. He doesn't talk about her much, but I know he still grieves. So if he seems too serious sometimes, too careful, that's why. Eleanor absorbed this information silently. It explained something about Reed Boone's manner, that sense of a man carrying weight he couldn't set down. I'm sorry for his loss. He'd tell you not to be, that it's old pain, but pain doesn't age, not really. It just settles in deeper. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. Anyway, we've got 4 hours before supper service. I need to run to the general store for supplies. Can you finish the vegetables and start on the bread dough? Of course. Alone in the kitchen, Eleanor fell into the work with something like relief. There was comfort in chopping onions and carrots, in the repetitive motion of the knife, in the sharp smell of vegetables and the solid weight of the cutting board. She'd never done this kind of work in Philadelphia. They'd had a cook, before her father's debts, and afterward Eleanor had survived mainly on bread and cheese and whatever she could afford from street vendors. But the motions came naturally, and she found herself settling into a rhythm that was almost peaceful. The back door opened without warning, and a man stepped into the kitchen. Eleanor looked up, startled, and found herself face to face with a miner she didn't recognize. Young, maybe 25, with dark hair and eyes that moved over her in a way that made her skin crawl. We're closed until 5, she said firmly, setting down the knife but keeping it within reach. I know. He moved closer, his smile showing too many teeth. I just wanted to meet you proper. I'm Daniel Cord. I was at breakfast this morning, saw you serving. Mr. Cord, you need to leave. Come back at supper time. Oh, don't be like that. I just want to talk. He was still advancing, backing her toward the counter. You're the mail-order bride, right? The one Whitmore didn't want? That must have stung. Eleanor's hand closed around the knife handle. Get out. See, I was thinking, you came all this way looking for a husband. Maybe you'd be interested in other offers. I got a claim that's doing pretty well, and I could use a woman around. I said, get out. Eleanor lifted the knife, holding it steady between them. Now, Daniel Cord's expression hardened. That's not very friendly. I'm not feeling friendly. I'm feeling like I'll use this knife if you take another step. They stood frozen for a moment, Eleanor's heart hammering against her ribs. She'd never threatened anyone with a weapon before, never even held a knife like this. But desperation made her hand steady. Daniel Cord seemed to be calculating his chances when the back door banged open again, and Reed Boone filled the doorway. He took in the scene instantly. Eleanor backed against the counter, knife raised, Cord standing too close. His expression went dark and dangerous in a way Eleanor hadn't seen before. Get out, Cord. Reed's voice was quiet, but something in it made the younger man step back immediately. And don't come back. I wasn't doing nothing, just talking. You were threatening her. I saw it through the window. Reed moved into the kitchen, and somehow he made it seem smaller just by being there. You've got 3 seconds to get out that door. After that, I stopped being polite. Daniel Cord looked between them, clearly weighing his options. Whatever he saw in Reed's face made the decision for him. He backed toward the door, hands raised. Fine. But you should know, Boone. Word around town is she's fair game. Mail-order bride who got left at the station? That's not exactly a respectable woman. Reed crossed the distance between them so fast Eleanor barely saw him move. He grabbed Cord by the shirt front and shoved him hard against the doorframe. You listen carefully. Miss Hayes is under my protection. That means she's off limits. You spread that word around town real clear. Anyone who bothers her, threatens her, or even looks at her wrong, they answer to me. Understand? Cord nodded jerkily, his face pale. Reed released him with a shove that sent him stumbling out onto the back steps. Get out of my sight. They watched Cord retreat across the yard and disappear around the building. Eleanor slowly lowered the knife, her hand shaking now that the danger had passed. She set it carefully on the counter and pressed her palms flat against the wood, trying to steady herself. You all right? Reed's voice was gentle now, all the menace gone. Yes, I'm fine. Eleanor. He moved closer, but didn't touch her. Look at me. She did, and was surprised to find concern rather than pity in his eyes. You handled that well, he said. Standing your ground, having a weapon ready, that was smart. I was terrified. Fear and smart aren't opposites. You can be scared and still do what needs doing. He glanced at the knife. You know how to use that? To cut vegetables, yes. To defend myself? Eleanor shook her head. I wouldn't even know how. Reed was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he picked up the knife, testing its weight. This is good steel. Sharp. That's important. But holding it like you were, handle way out, blade pointing straight. That's a good way to get it taken from you. I don't understand. Here. He moved behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. May I? Eleanor nodded, and Reed carefully positioned her hand on the knife, adjusting her grip. Hold it like this, firm but not tight, blade angled up. If someone grabs for it, you don't pull back. You push forward and slash across. Aim for the arm, the face, anywhere that'll make them let go. His hands were calloused and warm over hers, his voice low and steady as he talked her through the motion. Eleanor found herself focusing on his words, on the practical mechanics of defense rather than the fear still fluttering in her chest. This was useful information. This was something she could learn. Like this? She repeated the motion he'd shown her. Exactly like that. But Eleanor, and this is important, never pull a weapon unless you're willing to use it. Threats only work if the other person believes you'll follow through. Would I have used it? Eleanor asked quietly. If you hadn't come? I think you would have. I think you'd have done what needed doing to protect yourself. Reed stepped back, giving her space. But I'd rather you didn't have to find out, which is why I meant what I told Cord. You're under my protection now. Anyone wants to bother you, they'll answer to me first. Eleanor turned to face him. I don't want to be anyone's burden. You're not. You're my partner's responsibility that he abandoned, which makes you mine by default. That's just how it works. That's not how anything works. I'm not property to be passed between men. Reed's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe approval. No, you're not. But this is a mining town, Eleanor. There are rules here, unofficial ones. A woman alone, especially one in your situation, you need someone standing behind you, or men like Cord will keep testing. I'm offering to be that someone. Not because you're property, but because it's the right thing to do. Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could manage on her own. But the truth was, she'd been scared out of her wits moments ago. And if Reed hadn't arrived when he did, things might have gone very differently. Pride was one thing. Survival was another. All right, she said finally. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just be careful. Keep the doors locked when you're here alone. And if anyone bothers you, you come find me immediately. Promise me. I promise. Reed nodded, satisfied. He picked up his hat from where he'd dropped it and moved toward the door, then paused. Clara said you're settling in well. The miners speak highly of you. Do they? Says you're efficient and don't take guff. That's high praise from that crowd. His mouth quirked. They also say you make good coffee, which might be even more important. Eleanor found herself almost smiling. Clara makes the coffee. I just pour it. Then Clara makes good coffee and you pour it well. That's something. He settled his hat on his head. I'll check in tomorrow. And Eleanor, you did good today, standing up to Cord. Not everyone would have. He left before she could respond, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. Eleanor stood alone in the kitchen, still holding the knife, and realized her hands had stopped shaking. She set the knife down carefully and returned to chopping vegetables. But something had shifted inside her. Reed Boone had called her capable. He'd treated her like someone who could defend herself, who could learn and adapt and survive. Maybe he was right. Clara returned an hour later, arms full of supplies, and Eleanor told her about Daniel Cord. Clara's face went tight with anger. That snake! I should have warned you. The Cord brothers are trouble, all three of them. Reed ran them off the claim last year for stealing equipment. Daniel's the worst of the lot. Reed handled it. Of course he did. Clara began unpacking flour and sugar. Word'll spread now. Reed made his position clear, and that'll stop most of the nonsense, though there's always a few fools who think rules don't apply to them. They worked through the afternoon, preparing for supper service. Eleanor's body had settled into the rhythm of the work, the ache in her muscles becoming something she could push through rather than something that stopped her. She was learning the weight of cast iron pots, the heat patterns of the stove, the way to carry multiple plates without dropping them. Small skills, practical skills, but they made her feel competent in a way she hadn't felt in years. The supper crowd was larger than the night before. Word had spread that Clara had help now, which meant faster service and hotter food. Eleanor moved through the dining room with careful efficiency, balancing plates and pitchers, keeping her expression pleasant but distant. Some of the miners tried to engage her in conversation, asking where she was from, how she liked Silver Ridge, would she be staying long. She answered politely, but briefly, never lingering at any table. Reed appeared halfway through service, taking a seat at the corner table where he could see the whole room. He didn't order food, just coffee, but his presence changed the atmosphere immediately. Men who'd been getting too loud quieted down. The one miner who'd tried to grab Eleanor's wrist as she passed suddenly developed better manners. It should have annoyed her, this obvious protection, but mostly she just felt grateful. When the last customer finally left and Clara locked the door, Eleanor's feet were screaming again, and her back felt like it might never straighten. But she'd made it through another day. That was something. You're getting faster, Clara observed as they tackled the dishes. And you didn't drop anything tonight. I dropped a fork. That doesn't count. I meant plates. Clara handed her a dripping pot. Eleanor, I have to ask, how long are you planning to stay? Just so I know whether to count on you. Eleanor considered the question. I need $85 to get back to Philadelphia. At $2 a week, plus whatever tips the miners leave. The tips had been modest, just a few coins, but they added up. Maybe 8 or 9 months, unless I can find additional work. Clara was quiet for a moment. That's a long time to plan your whole life around leaving. What else am I supposed to do? This isn't my home. It could be, if you wanted it to be. Eleanor shook her head. I came here for a specific purpose. That purpose doesn't exist anymore. Once I've earned enough to leave with my dignity intact, I will. And what's waiting for you in Philadelphia? The question hit harder than Clara probably intended. Eleanor's hands stilled in the dishwater. What was waiting for her? Her father's creditors who might still try to collect from her. Her former friends who'd made it clear they wanted nothing to do with a woman whose reputation was tarnished. A city that held nothing but failed promises and bitter memories. Family? Clara pressed gently. Friends? A position? No. The word came out flat. Nothing's waiting for me. But at least it's familiar nothing. At least I know how to navigate it. Or you could learn to navigate something new. Clara dried her hands and turned to face Eleanor directly. I'm not trying to pressure you, but I see how hard you're working, how you're not backing down from anything. That's not someone just marking time until they can leave. That's someone who might be finding out they're stronger than they thought. Eleanor wanted to argue, but exhaustion made her honest. I don't know what I'm doing, Clara. I thought I did when I got on that train in Philadelphia. I thought I had a plan, a future, something solid. Now I'm sleeping in a room the size of a closet and serving miners, and my hands are raw, and I'm so tired I could cry. If this is strength, it doesn't feel like it. Strength rarely does in the moment. Usually it just feels like stubbornness and desperation. Claire's smile was sad and knowing. But you're still here. That counts for something. They finished the dishes in silence, and Eleanor retreated to her small room. She sat on the edge of the bed, too tired to undress properly, and stared at her hands. They were red and chapped, with small burns and cuts she didn't remember getting. These were working hands now, not a lady's hands. In Philadelphia, she would have been horrified. Here, they just seemed practical. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Clara's voice came through the door. Eleanor? Reed's still here. He wants to talk to you for a minute. Eleanor considered refusing. She was exhausted and didn't have the energy for whatever protective lecture Reed was planning. But curiosity won out. She opened the door to find Reed standing in the kitchen, hat in hands again, looking uncomfortable. I won't keep you long, he said. I know you're tired, but I wanted to... He stopped, started again. James is coming back from San Francisco next week. Him and his new wife. I thought you should know, so it's not a surprise when you see them. Eleanor's stomach dropped. She'd known James Whitmore would return eventually, but somehow she hadn't let herself think about it. I see. If you want to leave before then, I'll give you the money. No strings, no debt. Just so you don't have to face him. That's kind of you. Eleanor leaned against the doorframe, too tired to stand upright. But no, I'm staying. Eleanor, I'm staying, Reed. I'm not running away from James Whitmore. He's the one who should be ashamed, not me. Reed studied her for a long moment. You're right. He should be. But men like James, they don't do shame well. He'll try to justify what he did, make it seem reasonable somehow. It's going to be hard to watch. Then don't watch. But I'm staying. Stubborn. You say that like it's a bad thing. His mouth quirked. In this case, maybe it's not. But Eleanor, when James comes back, there's going to be talk. People are going to watch you, see how you react. Some will be hoping for drama, others will be hoping you fall apart. Don't give them the satisfaction. I don't plan to. Good. Reed turned his hat in his hands, clearly wanting to say something else. Finally, he just nodded. Get some rest. Tomorrow's another long day. He left, and Eleanor locked the door behind him. Through the thin walls, she could hear Clara moving around, banking the stove, checking windows. Normal sounds of a household settling for the night. Somewhere in the distance, the stamp mill kept its steady rhythm, crushing ore day and night, never stopping. The sound had annoyed Eleanor at first, but now she found it almost comforting. evidence that the world kept turning whether she was ready or not. She undressed slowly, washed her face and hands in cold water, and lay down on the narrow bed. Sleep should have come immediately, but instead she found herself staring at the ceiling, thinking about James Whitmore returning with his new bride. How would she react when she saw him? Would she be able to maintain her composure, or would she break down in front of the entire town? The old Eleanor, Philadelphia Eleanor, would have hidden, would have avoided any chance of confrontation. But she wasn't that Eleanor anymore. That version had died somewhere between the train station and this small room, dissolved in dishwater and hard work and the simple act of refusing to quit. This Eleanor, Silver Ridge Eleanor, would hold her head up and look James Whitmore straight in the eye. This Eleanor wasn't afraid of being seen as the woman who'd been rejected, because she knew now that the rejection said more about him than it did about her. Reed had been right about one thing. She was stubborn. But maybe stubbornness was just another name for survival. She was almost asleep when another sound cut through the night, shouting, breaking glass, the unmistakable sound of a fight starting at one of the saloons. Eleanor sat up, listening, but the noise didn't come closer. Eventually it faded, and she lay back down. This was Silver Ridge. This was her life now, at least for the next 8 or 9 months. She could survive it. She'd survived everything else. The thought should have been depressing, but somehow it wasn't. Somehow, lying in her small room listening to the stamp mill and the distant chaos of a mining town, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in years: possibility. She didn't know what that possibility might lead to. But for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she was curious enough to find out. The days took on a rhythm that Eleanor came to know by heart. Wake before dawn, help Clara prepare breakfast, serve the morning shift, clean and prep for supper, serve the evening crowd, collapse into bed with aching muscles and raw hands. A week passed, then 2, and somewhere in the repetition, Eleanor stopped counting days and started simply living them. The miners grew accustomed to her presence, and she to theirs. She learned their names, their habits, which ones liked their coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and which ones had a sweet tooth that made them linger over Clara's dried apple pie. Thomas Grant, the grizzled miner who'd been the first to speak to her kindly, appointed himself her unofficial guardian, glaring at any man who got too familiar. Others followed his lead, and gradually Eleanor found herself protected by an unlikely circle of rough men who decided she was worth defending. Reed came by every evening, usually during supper service, taking his corner table and nursing a single cup of coffee, while his gray eyes tracked every movement in the room. His presence was both reassuring and unsettling. Eleanor caught herself watching for him, listening for his footsteps on the porch, and she didn't know what that meant. He was just being protective, she told herself. It didn't mean anything more than that. On the 15th day, Eleanor had started marking them on a scrap of paper hidden in her drawer. Clara mentioned casually over breakfast prep that James Whitmore was due back that afternoon. Eleanor's knife slipped, nearly taking off the tip of her finger. She set it down carefully and pressed her palms flat against the work table. "I see," she managed. Clara glanced at her with concern. "Are you all right?" "Fine. Just thank you for telling me." But she wasn't fine. All morning, Eleanor's stomach churned with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Not fear exactly, and not even anger anymore, though that was still there underneath. It was more like the feeling of waiting for a storm to break, knowing it was coming, but not knowing how hard it would hit. The breakfast service was a blur. Eleanor moved mechanically, pouring coffee and clearing plates without really seeing them. When Thomas Grant asked if she was feeling poorly, she forced a smile and said she was just tired. He didn't look convinced, but he let it pass. By noon, the dining room was empty and cleaned, and Eleanor found herself with nothing to do but think. She retreated to her small room and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to prepare herself for the inevitable encounter. What would she say when she saw James Whitmore? What would he say to her? Would he apologize, justify, ignore her completely? A knock on her door made her jump. Clara's voice came through. "Eleanor, Reed's here. He wants to talk to you." Eleanor opened the door to find Reed standing in the kitchen, looking even more uncomfortable than usual. His hat was turning in his hands again, a nervous gesture she'd come to recognize. "James is back," he said without preamble. "Got in about an hour ago. Him and Sarah, that's his wife, They're at his house getting settled. Thank you for telling me. There's more. Reed's jaw tightened. He wants to see you, tonight, at the mining office. Says he wants to apologize and… Reed stopped, his expression darkening. And offer you some money. Settlement, he's calling it. Like you're a business deal gone wrong. Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest. How much? $50. $50. She repeated it slowly, tasting the insult. He thinks my humiliation, my time, my passage across the country, all of that is worth $50. I told him he was being a skinflint and a coward. Told him he owed you at least $100, plus passage home. But James… Reed's voice was tight with suppressed anger. He said 50 was more than fair for a business arrangement that didn't work out. Clara made a small, furious sound. Eleanor just stood there, feeling the rage build inside her like water behind a dam. She'd expected James Whitmore to be thoughtless, even cruel. But this casual dismissal of her worth, this reduction of her entire experience to a line item in his ledger, it was breathtaking in its cruelty. Do I have to go? She asked quietly. No. Reed's voice was firm. You don't have to do anything. I can tell him you refuse to see him. I can take the money if you want it, or I can tell him to go straight to… He caught himself. Tell him where he can put his settlement. Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, thinking. The old Eleanor would have hidden, would have avoided the confrontation and the pain. But she'd worked hard these past 2 weeks, harder than she'd ever worked in her life. And she'd earned something more valuable than money. She'd earned her own respect. She wasn't going to throw that away by cowering now. I'll go, she said. I'll meet him. Eleanor, I'll go, Reed, but you're coming with me. He studied her face, clearly trying to determine if she was certain. Whatever he saw there satisfied him, because he nodded once. All right, 6 o'clock at the mining office. I'll wait outside unless you want me in there with you. Outside is fine. I need to do this myself. After Reed left, Clara tried to convince Eleanor to eat something, but food seemed impossible. Eleanor spent the afternoon in a state of tense anticipation, going through the motions of prep work while her mind spun scenarios of what she might say, how she might react. By 5 o'clock, she was ready to crawl out of her skin. She changed into her better dress, the one she'd worn arriving in Silver Ridge, now cleaned and mended, and pinned her hair up carefully. When she looked in the small mirror, she saw a woman who looked older than she had 2 weeks ago, harder somehow, with shadows under her eyes, but also a set to her jaw that suggested she wouldn't break easily. Reed was waiting on the porch when she emerged. He didn't comment on her appearance, just offered his arm in a gesture that was both courtly and protective. Eleanor took it, grateful for the solid strength of him beside her. The walk to the mining office felt both too long and too short. Eleanor was aware of people watching, miners heading to the saloons, women in doorways, even children playing in the street stopped to stare. Word had spread, apparently. The whole town knew that the abandoned mail-order bride was going to confront the man who jilted her. They were probably hoping for a scene. She wouldn't give them one. The mining office looked the same as it had 2 weeks ago, the same faded green paint, the same sign declaring Whitmore and Boone proprietors. But everything else had changed. Eleanor climbed the steps with her spine straight and her head high, and when Reed opened the door for her, she walked through like she was entering a business meeting rather than a confrontation with her past. James Whitmore stood near the desk, and Eleanor's first thought was that he looked smaller than she'd imagined. The tintype had made him seem imposing, but in person, he was just a man of average height with thinning dark hair and a face that might have been handsome if not for the weak chin and the eyes that wouldn't quite meet hers. He wore a good suit, probably new, probably bought for the wedding, and his hands were soft and uncalloused. Miss Hayes, his voice was carefully neutral. Thank you for coming. Eleanor didn't respond, just stood in the center of the room and waited. Let him do the work of this conversation. Let him feel the discomfort of the silence. James cleared his throat. I suppose you know why I asked to see you. I'm told you want to give me money, a settlement, Reed called it. Yes, $50, which should cover your expenses and help you get back to Philadelphia. He moved to the desk, picking up an envelope. I want you to know what happened wasn't personal. It was just circumstances changed. I met Sarah and her father was willing to invest in the mine. and it made more sense from a business perspective to marry her instead of me, Eleanor finished, because she came with money and I didn't. James flushed. It wasn't just about money. Sarah and I, we have a connection. I'm sure you understand these things can't be forced. Sometimes arrangements just don't work out. Arrangements? Eleanor tasted the word. Is that what you call promising to marry someone, taking their money for passage, and then marrying someone else 3 days before they arrive? An arrangement that didn't work out? Miss Hayes, I understand you're upset. Upset. Eleanor's laugh was sharp and humorless. That's an interesting choice of word. I wonder what word you'd use if someone had done this to your sister, or to Sarah before she became your wife. James's flush deepened. I'm trying to do the right thing here. $50 is more than generous. Generous, Eleanor interrupted again. She seemed unable to stop herself, all the rage and humiliation of the past 2 weeks pouring out in these single-word repetitions that made James flinch. You think $50 is generous payment for lying to me? For leaving me stranded in a strange town with no money, no friends, no prospects? For making me the object of pity and gossip? I sent you a telegram, James said defensively. A week before you left Philadelphia. You must not have received it. You're lying. Eleanor's voice was flat and certain. There was no telegram. You couldn't even be bothered to warn me. You just hoped I wouldn't come, or that if I did, someone else would deal with the problem. James's face went stiff with anger. I don't appreciate being called a liar in my own office. And I don't appreciate being treated like a problem to be solved with $50. Eleanor took a step forward. But here we are, Mr. Whitmore. You're a liar and a coward, and I'm a woman who traveled 2,000 miles to marry a man who didn't have the decency to tell her he'd changed his mind. So let's stop pretending this is anything other than what it is, you trying to buy your way out of guilt. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. James stood frozen, the envelope still in his hand, his face mottled with angry color. Reed, who'd been standing quietly by the door, made a small sound that might have been approval. Finally, James set the envelope on the desk with careful precision. Take the money or don't, Miss Hayes. That's up to you. But I've fulfilled my obligation by offering it, and my conscience is clear. Your conscience, Eleanor said softly, must be a very convenient thing to have. She picked up the envelope, not because she thought the money was adequate, but because she'd earned it through every moment of suffering he'd caused, and turned toward the door. But before she left, she looked back at James Whitmore one last time. I hope your marriage brings you everything you deserve, she said. And I hope you remember every time you see me in this town that you're the one who should be ashamed. Not me, never me. She walked out with her head high, Reed following close behind. The street was full of people who'd clearly been waiting to see what would happen, their faces ranging from curious to sympathetic. Eleanor ignored them all, walking steadily back toward Clara's eating house with the envelope clutched in her hand. They were halfway there when Reed finally spoke. That was well done. I wanted to throw the money in his face. I know, but you didn't. That took more strength than throwing it would have. Eleanor's hands were shaking now that the confrontation was over, adrenaline draining away and leaving exhaustion in its wake. He really thought $50 would make it right, like I'm something he could just buy off and forget about. James always did think money solved everything. It's why we work well together. I know it doesn't, so I keep him from making an idiot of himself, usually. Reed's voice was grim. Though clearly I failed in this case. This isn't your fault, Reed. Isn't it? I'm his partner. I should have known what he was planning, should have stopped him. Eleanor stopped walking, turning to face him. The street was emptier here, away from the saloons and shops, and the evening sun cast long shadows between the buildings. You can't control what other people do. You can only control how you respond. And you've responded with nothing but kindness and support. That's more than I had any right to expect. Reed looked at her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his gray eyes. You had every right to expect basic human decency. The fact that you think kindness is more than you deserve, that says more about what you've been through than anything else. The words hit Eleanor harder than they should have, finding some tender place she'd thought she'd armored over. She turned away quickly, blinking hard. I should get back. Clara will need help with supper. But Reed's hand on her arm stopped her. Eleanor, wait. There's something I need to... He stopped, started again. These past 2 weeks, watching you work, watching you refuse to be beaten down, I want you to know that I... He stopped again, clearly struggling with what to say. Reed? Eleanor prompted gently. I think you're remarkable, he said finally, the words coming out in a rush. I know that's probably not appropriate to say, and I know you've got plans to leave as soon as you can, but I wanted you to know. What James did, leaving you, treating you like you weren't worth his time, that says everything about his judgment and nothing about your worth. Any man with eyes can see your... He stopped, seeming to realize he was rambling. I'm making a mess of this. Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest, something she immediately tried to suppress. Reed Boone was being kind, that was all. He felt responsible for his partner's actions. It didn't mean anything more than that. It couldn't. Thank you, she said quietly. Eat. That means more than you know. They continued walking, but the silence between them felt different now, charged with something Eleanor didn't want to examine too closely. When they reached the eating house, Reed tipped his hat and left without another word, and Eleanor stood on the porch watching his broad back disappear into the evening crowd. Inside, Clara took one look at her face and pulled her into a fierce hug. How did it go? About as well as could be expected. Eleanor extracted herself gently and set the envelope on the table. He gave me $50 and a lecture about business arrangements. I called him a liar and a coward. I think we're even now. Clara opened the envelope, counting the bills. This is more than 50. There's 75 here. Eleanor looked surprised. Had James put in extra without mentioning it? Or had Reed? She felt her face flush as understanding dawned. Reed had added to the settlement, quietly making up the difference James should have paid. She should have been insulted by the charity. Instead, she felt something uncomfortably close to tenderness. Reed, Clara said, clearly having reached the same conclusion. He can't help himself, always trying to fix things. He doesn't need to fix me. I don't think that's how he sees it. Clara's expression was knowing. Eleanor, my brother, he's not good with words. Never has been, even before his wife died. But he shows what he feels through actions, and lately, his actions all seem to involve making sure you're all right. He feels responsible because of James. Maybe that's how it started. But I know my brother, and that's not guilt I see in his eyes when he looks at you. Eleanor didn't know what to say to that, didn't want to think about what it might mean. So she changed the subject, asking about the evening menu, and Clara let her. But the knowledge sat between them, impossible to ignore completely. The supper service that night was subdued. Word had spread about Eleanor's confrontation with James Whitmore, and the miners seemed to be treating her with extra care, as if she might shatter if they spoke too loudly. It should have been comforting, but mostly it just reminded Eleanor that everyone in town knew her business, knew she'd been rejected and humiliated. Reed didn't come. His corner table stayed empty, and Eleanor found herself looking for him more than she wanted to admit. Maybe he was avoiding her after his awkward confession. Maybe he regretted saying she was remarkable. Maybe... At 8:30, just as Eleanor was clearing the last tables, the door burst open and a young miner stumbled in, wild-eyed and gasping. Miss Clara, there's been a collapse. East tunnel of the Silver Ridge mine. Men are trapped. Clara dropped the plate she was holding. How many? Don't know yet. 6, maybe more. They're calling for all hands to help dig. Eleanor felt ice flood her veins. What about Reed? Reed Boone, was he down there? The young miner's face told her everything before he spoke. He went down about an hour ago, him and 5 others. They hit a pocket of unstable rock, and the whole thing came down. The world tilted. Eleanor grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself, her mind refusing to process what she'd just heard. Reed was trapped, underground, possibly hurt. Possibly... She couldn't finish the thought. Clara was already moving, untying her apron and grabbing a shawl. Eleanor, lock up here. I need to get to the mine. I'm coming with you. No, you should stay. I'm coming. Eleanor's voice left no room for argument. She didn't understand the fierce urgency driving her, didn't want to examine why the thought of Reed, trapped and hurt, made her chest feel like it was being crushed. She just knew she had to go, had to be there, had to do something. They ran through the darkening streets, joining a stream of people all heading the same direction. The mine entrance was at the edge of town, marked by the stamp mill and the skeletal framework of the hoist works. A crowd had already gathered. Miners' families, off-shift workers, townspeople drawn by the drama of disaster. Lanterns created pools of harsh light against the gathering darkness, and somewhere in the chaos, someone was shouting orders. Clara pushed through the crowd, dragging Eleanor with her, until they reached the mine entrance. A man Eleanor didn't recognize was coordinating the rescue effort, assigning teams, organizing equipment, managing the controlled chaos of men trying to save their trapped friends. "How bad is it?" Clara demanded. The man, the shift supervisor, Eleanor would learn later, shook his head grimly. "Bad enough. The east tunnel's blocked about 200 feet in. We've got 6 men trapped on the other side, including Reed Boone. They're alive. We can hear them tapping on the rock, but we don't know how much air they've got or if there's going to be another collapse. How long to dig them out?" "Hours, maybe all night. The rock's unstable, so we have to shore it up as we go." He looked at Clara with genuine sympathy. "I'm sorry, Clara. We're doing everything we can." "I know you are." Clara's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "Can we help?" "We need water for the workers, food if you can manage it, and—" He hesitated. "If you've got a mind to pray, that wouldn't hurt either." Clara nodded and turned away, already planning. Eleanor followed, her mind strangely detached from her body. This was happening. Reed was trapped underground, buried alive, and there was nothing she could do but wait. They returned to the eating house and worked with frantic efficiency, making sandwiches and coffee, gathering every container they could find to carry water. Within an hour, they were back at the mine, distributing food and drink to the rescue workers who came up in shifts, exhausted and covered in rock dust. Eleanor worked mechanically, her hands busy while her mind spun terrible scenarios. What if they didn't reach the trapped men in time? What if there was another collapse that killed the rescuers? What if Reed was already hurt, bleeding, dying while she stood here helplessly handing out sandwiches? The hours crawled past. Midnight came and went. The crowd thinned as people gave up and went home to wait for news, but Eleanor and Clara stayed, refusing to leave. Thomas Grant appeared at some point, his old face creased with worry, and stood with them in silent support. At 2 a.m, a shout went up from inside the mine. They'd broken through. Eleanor's heart leaped, hope flooding through her for the first time in hours. Minutes passed with agonizing slowness as they waited for the trapped men to emerge. The first miner came out supported by 2 others, limping but alive. Then a second and a third. Eleanor counted them with desperate attention. 4, 5. 6 men emerged from the darkness, and with each one she searched for Reed's face, his tall frame. The 6th man was the last of the trapped miners, and Reed wasn't among them. Eleanor felt Clara go rigid beside her. "Where's Reed?" Clara called out. "The supervisor said there were 6 men trapped. Where's my brother?" One of the rescued miners turned to face them, his face ghostly pale beneath the rock dust. "He stayed behind. Found a smaller collapse further in, thought there might be someone else trapped. Told us to go ahead, said he'd follow, but—" The miner's voice broke. "But then we heard another rumble. More rock coming down." "No." The word came out of Eleanor like a prayer, like a denial of reality itself. "No, he can't. He has to—" She was moving before she consciously decided to, pushing past the supervisor, past the workers, heading for the mine entrance. Clara grabbed her arm, but Eleanor shook her off. "Eleanor, you can't go down there." "Watch me." Strong hands caught her from behind. Thomas Grant, holding her firm despite her struggles. "Miss Hayes, listen to me. You can't help him by getting yourself killed. Let the professionals handle this." "Let me go. I have to. Eleanor realized she was crying, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "He can't die down there. Not because of James, not because he was trying to help someone else. It's not fair." "No, it's not," Thomas said gently. "But that's Reed Boone for you, always putting himself last. Now come on, step back. Let them work." The rescue team was already heading back into the mine, grim-faced men who knew the risks but went anyway. Eleanor stood frozen, held in place by Thomas's hands and Clara's desperate grip on her other arm, and watched them disappear into the darkness. More waiting. More terrible minutes that felt like hours. Eleanor found herself bargaining with forces she didn't believe in. If Reed came out alive, she'd do anything, be anything, give up anything. Just let him be all right. Just let him survive this. It was Clara who said softly, "You care about him." Eleanor couldn't deny it anymore, couldn't hide behind pretense or propriety. "Yes, I don't know when it happened, but yes, I care about him. He cares about you too. Has from the beginning, I think. He just didn't know how to say it. He told me today. Before this. He said I was remarkable." Clara's laugh was choked with tears. "That's Reed. Terrible with words, but when he finally says something, he means it." A commotion at the mine entrance made them both turn. Men were emerging again, moving faster this time, and between them they carried someone on a makeshift stretcher. Eleanor's heart stopped as she recognized Reed's tall frame, his light brown hair dark with blood and dust. She was running before Clara could stop her, pushing through the crowd, reaching Reed's side just as they set the stretcher down. His eyes were closed, his face covered in cuts and bruises, his shirt torn and bloody. But his chest was moving. He was breathing. "Reed!" Eleanor dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch, afraid she'd hurt him further. "Reed, can you hear me?" His eyes flickered open, unfocused and dazed. "Eleanor?" "I'm here. You're out. You're safe." "Found him," Reed mumbled, his words slurred. "The other man. Had to get him out. Had to—" He winced, his face going gray with pain. "Don't talk, just rest. You're going to be all right." Eleanor wasn't sure if she was telling the truth or just saying what she needed to hear. The town doctor arrived, pushing people aside, kneeling to examine Reed with practiced efficiency. "Broken ribs, probably. Head injury, lots of cuts and bruises. But he's alive, which is more than he should be. Let's get him to my office." They lifted Reed carefully, and Eleanor walked beside the stretcher, her hand somehow finding his and holding tight. He squeezed back weakly, and that small gesture broke something inside her. He was alive. Against all odds, he'd survived. That had to mean something. At the doctor's office, they laid Reed on an examination table and the doctor shooed everyone out except Clara. Eleanor stood in the waiting area with Thomas Grant and a handful of other miners, all of them silent and grim-faced. The wait seemed endless, though it was probably only an hour before Clara emerged. "He's going to be fine," she said, and the relief in her voice made several miners visibly sag. 3 broken ribs, a concussion, a dislocated shoulder that the doctor popped back in, and more cuts and bruises than you can count. But he'll heal. Doc says he was lucky. "Lucky," Eleanor repeated, thinking about the terrible hours of not knowing, the image of Reed carried out on a stretcher. This was what luck looked like in a mining town, surviving when you probably shouldn't have. "He's asking for you," Clara said, looking directly at Eleanor. "He's supposed to rest, but he won't settle until he talks to you." Eleanor followed Clara into the back room where the doctor had his examination area. Reed lay propped up on pillows, his torso wrapped in bandages, his face cleaned of blood, but showing the full extent of the bruising. He looked terrible. He looked beautiful. He looked alive. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. "Sorry for the scare." Eleanor moved to his bedside, and without thinking about propriety or what it might mean, she took his hand again. "You idiot. You absolute idiot. What were you thinking, going back in there?" "Thought there might be someone else trapped. Turned out I was right. Found Peterson from the night shift. Got him out just before the second collapse." Reed squeezed her hand. "Worth it. It wasn't worth dying for. Wasn't planning on dying." His mouth quirked. Had too many reasons to live. Eleanor felt tears threatening again and blinked them back furiously. "You're never going down in that mine again. I don't care how many people need rescuing. You're done." "Eleanor, I mean it, Reed. I can't—" Her voice broke. "I can't watch you die down there in the dark. I just can't." He was looking at her with such open emotion that it made her want to run and stay simultaneously. "I scared you. Terrified me. I've never been so frightened in my life. I'm sorry." He pulled her hand up, pressing it against his chest where she could feel his heart beating steady and strong beneath the bandages. But I'm here. I'm all right. And Eleanor, what I said earlier, before all this, I meant it. Every word. Eleanor looked at this man who'd shown her nothing but kindness, who'd protected her and supported her, and somehow made her feel worthy of protection and support. This man who'd nearly died tonight and was using his limited strength to make sure she knew he cared about her. She leaned down and kissed his forehead gently, carefully, mindful of his injuries. Rest now. We'll talk when you're healed. That's not fair. Can't argue when I'm like this. Exactly. That's why I'm doing it now. Eleanor straightened but kept hold of his hand. Sleep, Reed. I'll be here when you wake up. His eyes were already drifting closed, exhaustion and pain medication pulling him under. Promise? I promise. She sat beside his bed through the rest of the night, Clara dozing in a chair nearby, and watched Reed sleep. Watched his chest rise and fall, counted his breaths, memorized the lines of his face. And somewhere in those quiet hours, Eleanor admitted something she'd been avoiding since the moment she'd heard he was trapped. She wasn't leaving Silver Ridge. Not in 8 months. Not ever. Because somewhere between serving coffee and learning to defend herself with a knife, between standing up to James Whitmore and standing beside this man's sickbed, she'd found something she hadn't been looking for. She'd found home. And home, it turned out, wasn't a place. It was a person. It was Reed Boone, with his quiet strength and his terrible way with words, and his habit of putting everyone else first. It was this impossible mining town where she'd been abandoned and found herself simultaneously. The sun was rising when Reed finally opened his eyes again, finding Eleanor still there, still holding his hand. He smiled. A real smile, not the careful half-expression she'd seen before, and Eleanor smiled back, tears and joy mixing together in a way that felt almost like healing. Still here, he said softly. Still here, Eleanor confirmed, and I'm not going anywhere. His fingers tightened around hers. Promise? I promise. And this time she meant it as something more than comfort. She meant it as truth, as commitment, as the beginning of whatever came next. Reed seemed to understand because his smile widened despite the obvious pain it caused, and his eyes held something that looked almost like hope. Outside the window, Silver Ridge was waking up. The stamp mill starting its rhythm, miners heading to work, the town moving forward because that's what towns did. They survived. They endured. They found ways to keep going even after disaster. Eleanor understood that now. She'd become part of it. Part of this place, these people. This life she'd never planned but somehow couldn't imagine leaving. The mail-order bride who'd been abandoned had found something better than the future she'd expected. She'd found the future she'd needed all along, even though she hadn't known it until now. Reed's recovery was slow and stubborn, much like the man himself. The doctor insisted he stay off his feet for at least 2 weeks. No work, no heavy lifting, nothing that might aggravate his broken ribs or risk another head injury. Reed lasted 3 days before he tried to sneak down to the mining office, only to be intercepted by Clara, who threatened to tie him to his bed if he didn't stop being foolish. Eleanor watched this battle of wills with a mixture of amusement and exasperation. She'd taken to spending her free hours at Reed's boarding house room, bringing him meals from the eating house, and sitting with him while he pretended he wasn't bored out of his mind. They talked about everything and nothing. Her life in Philadelphia, his years building the mine, Claire's dreams of expanding the eating house. Sometimes they just sat in comfortable silence while Reed dozed and Eleanor mended his shirts, which had been torn beyond repair during the collapse. It was during one of these quiet afternoons, a week after the accident, that Reed finally brought up what had been unspoken between them since that night in the doctor's office. "Eleanor," he said, setting down the mining report he'd been pretending to read, "what did you mean when you said you weren't going anywhere?" Eleanor's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. She'd known this conversation was coming, had been both anticipating and dreading it. "I meant what I said. I'm staying in Silver Ridge." "But your plans, saving money for passage home, going back to Philadelphia, those were plans made by someone who thought she had something to go back to." Eleanor set down her sewing and met his gaze directly. "I don't." Philadelphia has nothing for me but bad memories and people who made it clear I wasn't welcome. Here, I have work. I have Clara, who's become a true friend. I have... She stopped, suddenly uncertain. Have what? Reed prompted gently. I have reasons to stay, Eleanor finished, unable to quite say what she meant. Unable to tell him that he was the main reason, that watching him nearly die had made her realize how much she'd come to care for him. Reed was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes searching her face. The $75 from James, that's enough for passage, isn't it? If you wanted to leave. It is. But you're not taking it. No. Eleanor picked up her sewing again, needing something to do with her hands. I have a different plan for that money, actually. If you'll hear me out. I'm listening. Eleanor took a breath, organizing the thoughts she'd been turning over in her mind for days. Clara's been running that eating house alone for months, working herself to exhaustion trying to keep up. She's told me she's always dreamed of expanding, maybe adding rooms for boarders, turning it into a proper boarding house. But she doesn't have the capital to start. And you want to invest your $75, Reed said slowly. I want to become her partner, equal shares in an expanded business. Clara provides the building and her expertise. I provide the investment and additional labor. We'd split profits 50-50. Eleanor looked up from her sewing. I've been doing the calculations. With a few rooms for rent and the existing meal service, we could make a decent living. Nothing extravagant, but steady, honest. Reed leaned back against his pillows, wincing slightly at the movement. Have you talked to Clara about this? Not yet. I wanted to... Eleanor hesitated. I wanted to make sure I was staying for the right reasons first. That I wasn't just running away from Philadelphia, but running towards something real. And are you? Staying for the right reasons? Eleanor set down her sewing again and stood, moving to the window. Outside, Silver Ridge sprawled in all its chaotic glory. Rough buildings and rutted streets, miners and merchants and families, all trying to make lives in this impossible place. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't refined. It wasn't anything like what she'd imagined her life would be. But it was honest. It was real. And somewhere in the past month, it had become hers. I'm staying because for the first time in years, I feel like I'm building something that matters, she said quietly. In Philadelphia, I was always trying to fit into someone else's idea of who I should be. My father's idea of a proper daughter, Robert Dalton's idea of a suitable wife, even James Whitmore's idea of a practical mail-order bride. But here, she turned to face Reed, here, I get to decide who I am, and I like the person I'm becoming. Reed's expression was hard to read. And if I told you that I want you to stay for a different reason, a more personal reason? Eleanor's heart kicked hard against her ribs. What reason would that be? Come here, Reed said, patting the chair beside his bed. Eleanor returned to her seat, and Reed reached for her hand. His palm was warm and calloused against hers, and she found herself thinking about the first time he'd shaken her hand in the mining office, how solid and reliable he'd seemed even then. I told you before that I think you're remarkable, Reed said. What I didn't say, what I couldn't say with you planning to leave, is that watching you these past weeks has been like watching someone come back to life. You arrived here broken, and I've watched you put yourself back together into someone stronger than before. Someone who doesn't take guff from minors or cowards who abandon their promises. Someone who works harder than anyone I've ever met and never complains. Someone who... He stopped, his jaw working. Someone I've come to care about more than I thought I could care about anyone after Sarah died. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Reed, let me finish. Please. He squeezed her hand. I'm not asking you to stay for me. If you want to stay and build a business with Clara, that's reason enough. But I need you to know that if you stay, I'm going to court you properly. The way I should have been doing all along, if I hadn't been so worried about your plans to leave. I'm going to take you to dinner, well, once I can walk without help, and I'm going to bring you flowers and ask your permission to call on you, all the things a man should do when he's serious about a woman. You're serious about me? Eleanor's voice came out barely above a whisper. I've been serious about you since you held that knife on Daniel Cord and looked ready to use it, maybe even before that, if I'm honest. From the moment you refused my charity and insisted on earning your own way. Reed's mouth quirked. You scared me, if you want the truth. Made me feel things I thought I'd buried with Sarah. But these past days, thinking about you leaving, going back to Philadelphia, that scared me worse. Eleanor looked at their joined hands, at the contrast between her work-roughened fingers and his scarred knuckles. They matched, somehow. Both of them marked by hard work and harder choices. Both of them building new lives from the ruins of old ones. I was terrified when I heard you were trapped, she said quietly. I've never been that frightened, not even when my father died, and I realized I had nothing left. Because losing you, losing this, she gestured between them. It felt like losing something I hadn't even known I wanted until it was almost gone. Eleanor, Reed pulled her hand up, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Stay. Build your business with Clara. Build a life here. And let me be part of it, if you're willing. I'm willing, Eleanor said, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. I'm very willing. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, both of them smiling like fools. Then Reed tugged gently on her hand, pulling her closer, and Eleanor understood what he was asking. She leaned down carefully, mindful of his injuries, and kissed him. It was nothing like the polite, proper kisses she'd exchanged with Robert Dalton in Philadelphia. This was real and warm and tasted like possibility. When they finally pulled apart, Reed was grinning despite the obvious pain it caused his bruised face. Worth breaking a few ribs for, he said. Don't even joke about that. You're never going down in that mine again. We'll see. Reed Boone, I know, but Eleanor, mining's what I do, what I'm good at. I can't just stop because of one accident. Eleanor wanted to argue, wanted to make him promise he'd never risk his life like that again, but she understood, looking at his stubborn expression, that this was part of who Reed was. He took risks because people depended on him, because it was the right thing to do, because that's what leaders did. She couldn't change that any more than he could change her determination to succeed on her own terms. So instead of arguing, she kissed him again and felt him smile against her lips. Later that evening, Eleanor sat with Clara in the eating house kitchen after the supper service had ended. The dining room was clean, the dishes washed, and they had a rare moment of peace before exhaustion sent them both to bed. Clara, Eleanor said, setting down her coffee cup with careful precision. I have a proposition for you. Clara looked up with tired curiosity. What kind of proposition? Eleanor laid out her plan. The investment, the partnership, the expansion into a boarding house with multiple rooms for rent. She'd thought it through carefully, anticipated Clara's questions, prepared answers about profits and responsibilities and risk. By the time she finished, Clara was sitting forward in her chair, exhaustion forgotten, her eyes bright with possibility. You're serious, Clara said. You really want to do this. I'm completely serious. I know it's a risk. The money might not be enough, or we might not get enough boarders, or it could work, Clara interrupted. It could actually work. Eleanor, I've been dreaming about expanding for 2 years, but I never had the capital or the help. With both of us working, with your investment, she stopped, overcome. This could change everything. It could, Eleanor agreed. But I need you to understand something. I'm not just investing money. I'm investing myself, my future. I'm staying in Silver Ridge permanently. This isn't a temporary arrangement. Claire's smile was brilliant. I was hoping you'd say that. Reed would have been devastated if you left. Reed told you? Reed didn't have to tell me anything. I have eyes. Clara reached across the table and took Eleanor's hands. He cares about you, more than I've seen him care about anything since Sarah died. And you care about him too, I can see it. So yes, let's be partners. Let's build something together. And let's make sure my stubborn brother knows he's not the only one in this family who can run a successful business. They shook hands formally, then dissolved into slightly giddy laughter, both of them aware they were making a decision that would shape the rest of their lives. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was exactly what Eleanor needed. Over the next few weeks, they threw themselves into planning. Clara knew a carpenter who could add rooms onto the back of the eating house, extending it toward the empty lot she owned behind the building. Eleanor drafted advertisements for the boarding rooms, calculated rates that would be competitive but profitable, and made lists of supplies they'd need. They decided to keep the existing meal service, but expand the menu, maybe add a Sunday dinner that would attract families as well as minors. Reed recovered slowly, spending his forced convalescence reviewing their plans and offering suggestions. He knew the town, knew which merchants would give them fair prices, knew how to navigate the informal power structures that governed Silver Ridge. His business advice was invaluable, but even more valuable was the way he looked at Eleanor when she explained her ideas, like she was capable of anything she set her mind to. The formal courtship began once Reed could walk without wincing. He showed up at the eating house one evening after supper service with a bouquet of wildflowers he'd clearly ridden miles to find, since nothing grew wild in Silver Ridge's dusty streets. Eleanor accepted them with a smile that made Clara tease her mercilessly later. Their first proper outing was to a community dance held at the largest saloon, which had been temporarily cleared of gambling tables and made respectable for the evening. Eleanor wore her best dress, the one she'd arrived in, now carefully mended and pressed, and Reed wore a suit that looked uncomfortable on his large frame, but showed he was making an effort. They weren't the only couple there, but Eleanor was aware of the eyes on them, the whispers that followed their movements. The mail-order bride who'd been jilted, now courting her former groom's business partner. The town would talk. They were probably already talking. Reed seemed to sense her discomfort because he leaned down and murmured, "Let them stare. We know the truth, and that's all that matters." The truth being? That you're the strongest woman I've ever met, and I'm the lucky fool who gets to dance with you. Eleanor laughed despite herself. That's the most words I've ever heard you string together at once. Don't get used to it. I'm not much for speeches. I like that about you. You say what you mean, and you mean what you say. They danced. Reed was surprisingly graceful for such a large man, and gradually Eleanor stopped noticing the stares. This was her life now. Her town, her people, her future. Anyone who wanted to judge her for it could keep their opinions to themselves. James Whitmore appeared halfway through the evening, his new wife Sarah on his arm. Eleanor saw them enter and felt Reed tense beside her, ready to intervene if necessary. But Eleanor just watched them calmly, noting how James's eyes skittered away from hers, how uncomfortable he looked in his expensive suit. Sarah Whitmore was pretty in a delicate way, with pale blonde hair and a dress that probably cost more than Eleanor had earned in the past month. She looked around the rough saloon with barely concealed disdain, clearly finding Silver Ridge lacking compared to wherever she'd come from. "Eleanor," Reed said quietly, "we can leave if you want." "No." Eleanor straightened her spine. "I'm not leaving. I'm not hiding. And I'm certainly not letting James Whitmore run me off." So they stayed, and when the next dance started, Eleanor made sure she and Reed were clearly visible on the floor. She saw James watching them, saw the moment he registered that Reed, his business partner, was courting the woman he'd abandoned. The expression on his face was complicated: surprise, discomfort, maybe even a flash of jealousy. Good, Eleanor thought with fierce satisfaction. Let him see what he gave up. Let him see that his rejection hadn't destroyed her. It had freed her. After the dance, they walked back to the eating house through streets that had become familiar, past buildings Eleanor could now name, greeting miners who tipped their hats and called her by name. This was belonging, she realized. This was what it felt like to be part of a community, to have a place and a purpose. At the eating house door, Reed hesitated. "Eleanor, about what happened tonight, James being there." "It's fine, Reed. Better than fine, actually. I needed to see him, to prove to myself that he doesn't have power over me anymore." Eleanor looked up at Reed's shadowed face. "Do you know what I felt when I saw him?" "Tell me." "Nothing. No anger, no pain, no regret. Just nothing. He's just a man who made a choice, and that choice led me here. To this." She gestured around them, encompassing the eating house, the town, Reed himself. "I wouldn't change it, even if I could." Reed cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "I don't deserve you." "Yes, you do. We both deserve happiness, Reed. We both deserve second chances." He kissed her then, standing in the doorway with the sounds of Silver Ridge all around them, the stamp mill and the saloons and the distant bark of a dog. It wasn't romantic by Philadelphia standards, But by Silver Ridge standards, by the standards of two people who'd found each other in the aftermath of loss and betrayal, it was perfect. The weeks that followed fell into a new rhythm. Construction on the boarding house addition began, the sound of hammers and saws joining the omnipresent rhythm of the stamp mill. Eleanor and Clara worked alongside the carpenters when they could, painting walls and installing curtains and slowly transforming their vision into reality. Reed helped in the evenings. His ribs finally healed enough for light work, though Eleanor watched him like a hawk to make sure he didn't overdo it. The first boarder arrived before they were even finished, a school teacher named Miss Porter who'd been hired to start a school in Silver Ridge and needed respectable lodging. She was followed by a widow who'd come west to join her son, and then by a young couple saving money to buy their own claim. Within 2 months of opening, all 4 rooms were occupied, and there was a waiting list. The business worked. More than worked. It thrived. Eleanor discovered she had a talent for management, for keeping accounts and solving problems and making people feel welcome. Claire's cooking drew crowds every evening, and the combination of good food and clean rooms gave the establishment a reputation as the best place in town for respectable lodging. They named it the Hayes House, despite Eleanor's protests that it should be the Boone House, since Clara owned the building. But Clara insisted, saying that Eleanor's investment and vision had made it possible, and besides, Hayes House had a good sound to it. Eleanor privately thought it was a way of reclaiming her name, making it stand for something other than the mail-order bride who got left. Now, when people said Eleanor Hayes, they meant the capable businesswoman who ran a successful boarding house. That felt like victory. Reed proposed on a Sunday evening in October, 2 months after Eleanor had become Clara's partner. They were sitting on the porch of the Hayes house, watching the sun set over the hills that surrounded Silver Ridge. The day had been unusually slow. Most of their boarders had gone visiting, and Clara had taken the rare opportunity to visit a friend, leaving Reed and Eleanor alone for the first time in weeks. "Eleanor," Reed said, setting down the coffee cup he'd been holding, "I have something to ask you." Eleanor looked at him, noting the unusual nervousness in his expression. "What is it?" "I'm not good at this. Speeches and fancy words aren't my strength. But I need you to know these past months with you have been the happiest I've had in years. You've brought life back to this town, back to Clara, back to me. Every morning I wake up grateful that James was enough of a fool to let you go, because it meant I got to find you." Eleanor felt her heart start to race. "Reed, let me finish, please. I know we haven't been courting long by normal standards, and I know you've got your business with Clara, and you're independent, and you don't need a husband, but Eleanor," he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I'm hoping you might want one anyway. Want me, specifically." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band with a small ruby stone. It wasn't extravagant, but it was beautiful. And the way Reed was looking at her, hopeful and nervous and absolutely sincere, made it the most precious thing Eleanor had ever seen. "That was Sarah's ring," Reed said quietly. "It's the only thing I kept after she died. I had it reset with a different stone, made it into something new, because I hoped that maybe you'd accept it. But if it makes you uncomfortable, if you'd rather have something that wasn't hers first, I understand." "Reed." Eleanor took the box from his shaking hands. "It's perfect. You're perfect. And yes." "Yes?" He looked almost comically surprised, like he'd expected her to refuse. "Yes, I'll marry you. Of course I'll marry you." Reed let out a breath that might have been relief or laughter or both. He took the ring from the box and slid it onto Eleanor's finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with such fierce joy that Eleanor found herself laughing against his mouth. "I love you," Reed said when they finally pulled apart. "I should have said that first. I love you, Eleanor Hayes. I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you refuse to back down from anything. I love that you scare me a little and make me want to be better than I am." "I love you too," Eleanor said, and realized she'd been waiting to say those words for weeks, maybe longer. "I love that you're honest and protective and terrible with words except when it matters most. I love that you let me be strong without trying to make me weak. I love—" Her voice caught. "I love that you see me, really see me, and you like what you see." They sat together as the sun finished setting, turning the sky brilliant shades of orange and pink that seemed impossible over such a dusty town. Eleanor twisted the ring on her finger, still hardly believing this was real. 6 months ago, she'd been a desperate woman on a train, fleeing to marry a stranger. Now she was a successful businesswoman engaged to a man she genuinely loved. James Whitmore's betrayal had felt like the end of everything. It turned out to be the beginning. The news of their engagement spread through Silver Ridge with the usual speed of small-town gossip. The reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Most people seemed to think Reed and Eleanor were well matched, and several miners made a point of congratulating Eleanor personally, saying Reed was lucky to have found such a capable woman. The only sour note came from James Whitmore himself. He cornered Reed at the mining office 3 days after the engagement was announced, and their raised voices carried through the thin walls to where Clara was working on the books. "You're making a fool of yourself," James said, his voice tight with anger. "Marrying that woman just to spite me." "This has nothing to do with you," Reed interrupted. "Eleanor's not that woman. She's the woman I love. And if you think I'd marry anyone just to spite you, you're more of an idiot than I thought. She came here to marry me. Doesn't that bother you, that you're getting my leftovers?" The sound of furniture scraping was followed by Reed's voice, dangerously quiet. "Say that again. I dare you." There was a long pause, then James's voice, more subdued. "Look, I just think you should be careful. You don't really know her. I know her better than you ever bothered to. I know she's hardworking and honest and braver than most men I've met. I know she turned $75 that could have been her ticket home into a thriving business. I know she held a knife on Daniel Cord and meant it. And I know that abandoning her was the worst decision you ever made, even if you're too stubborn to admit it. I have Sarah. You have Sarah's father's money. There's a difference. And from what I've seen, Sarah's not particularly happy here. Homesick, lonely, wondering why she married a man who spends all his time at the mine or avoiding his wife." Reed's voice softened slightly. "James, I don't want to fight with you. We're partners and we need to work together. But I need you to understand something. Eleanor's going to be my wife. That makes her off limits for your comments, your opinions, or your regrets. You made your choice. Let me make mine." After that conversation, James kept his distance. Eleanor saw him occasionally around town, usually with Sarah, and they exchanged polite nods, but nothing more. Sarah herself seemed pleasant enough when Eleanor encountered her at the general store, a bit lost and overwhelmed by Silver Ridge's rough edges, but not unkind. Eleanor almost felt sorry for her, this delicate woman who'd probably expected something very different when she married a mine owner. But mostly, Eleanor was too busy to think about the Whitmores. The Hayes house was thriving, requiring constant attention. Eleanor had hired 2 additional girls to help with cleaning and serving, and she spent her days managing schedules, ordering supplies, handling complaints, and somehow finding time to help Clara in the kitchen when things got hectic. She loved every exhausting minute of it. The wedding was planned for late November, after the autumn rain season, but before winter made travel too difficult. They kept it simple: a ceremony at the mining office with just close friends, followed by a celebration dinner at the Hayes house. Eleanor wore a new dress she'd made herself, pale blue silk she'd ordered from San Francisco, and Clara helped her arrange her hair with wildflowers Reed had once again ridden miles to find. Standing in front of the judge who rode the circuit through mining towns, holding Reed's work-roughened hands and speaking vows she meant with every fiber of her being, Eleanor thought about the woman who'd arrived in Silver Ridge 6 months ago. That woman had been broken, desperate, willing to accept whatever scraps of life came her way. This woman, the woman Eleanor had become, didn't accept scraps. She demanded more. She built more. She was more. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge said. "You may kiss your bride." Reed did, thoroughly and enthusiastically enough to make their small audience laugh and cheer. When they finally pulled apart, both of them grinning like fools, Eleanor caught sight of Clara wiping tears from her eyes, and Thomas Grant beaming like a proud father. This was her family now. Not bound by blood, but by choice, by shared struggle, by the simple act of showing up for each other day after day. This was what she'd been looking for without knowing it. Not a husband to rescue her, but people to build a life alongside. a place to belong that she'd earned through her own determination and hard work. The celebration dinner was loud and joyful, with miners and boarders and townspeople crowding into the Hayes house dining room. There were speeches. Reed's was predictably brief and sincere. Clara's was tearful and proud. Thomas Grant's was rambling but heartfelt. Eleanor didn't make a speech, just stood beside her new husband and felt the weight of her new future settling around her shoulders like a comfortable shawl. Later, when the last guest had finally left and they were alone in the room Reed had been adding on to the back of the Hayes house, their private space, separate from the boarding rooms, Eleanor kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto the bed with a groan of relief. "My feet are killing me," she said. "How do miners work 12-hour shifts? I only worked 6 and I'm exhausted." Reed sat beside her, pulling her feet into his lap and beginning to rub them gently. "You've been running around for weeks getting everything ready. It's allowed to catch up with you. I thought weddings were supposed to be romantic and dreamy. Nobody warns you about the blisters. This is romantic. I'm rubbing your feet." Eleanor laughed, looking at this man who was now her husband, and felt something settle in her chest. Contentment, maybe, or just the simple recognition that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. "Reed Boone, I think I made a very good decision marrying you." "I think you made a very good decision staying in Silver Ridge," Reed countered. "The marrying me part was just a bonus. Modest as always. Honest as always." He set her feet down gently and lay beside her, both of them still fully dressed, too tired to do more than hold each other. "Eleanor, I need you to know something. I don't expect you to give up the Hayes house or stop working just because we're married. This is your business, your success. I'm proud of that. I'm proud of you." Eleanor turned to face him, studying his serious expression. "You mean that?" "Of course I mean it. Why would I want you to stop being the woman I fell in love with?" Reed brushed a strand of hair from her face. "We're partners, Eleanor, in business and in life. That means we support each other's dreams, not sacrifice them." "I'm very glad I didn't marry James Whitmore," Eleanor said quietly. "So am I, though I wish you hadn't had to go through that pain to get here." "Maybe I did, though. Maybe I needed to hit bottom before I could figure out who I really was, what I really wanted." Eleanor laced her fingers through Reed's. "James abandoning me, it was the worst thing that had happened to me at the time, but it forced me to save myself instead of waiting to be saved, and that made all the difference." Reed pulled her closer, and they lay together as the sounds of Silver Ridge filtered through the windows. The eternal stamp mill, distant laughter from the saloons, the bark of a dog somewhere in the darkness. Outside this room was a town full of people who knew Eleanor's story, who'd watched her transform from abandoned bride to successful businesswoman. Inside this room was a future she'd built with her own hands, brick by brick, choice by choice. "His loss," Reed murmured against her hair, echoing the words he'd said months ago. "Definitely his loss." "My gain," Eleanor corrected softly. "Our gain." And lying there in the darkness, still wearing her wedding dress, too tired to move but too content to care, Eleanor Hayes Boone felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not just happiness, but certainty. The kind of bone-deep certainty that comes from knowing you've chosen the right path, even if it wasn't the path you planned. Tomorrow they'd wake up and return to work. Reed to the mine, Eleanor to the boarding house. There would be meals to serve and accounts to balance, and 100 small problems to solve. Life would go on, not perfect but real, not easy but honest. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything. The first winter of Eleanor's marriage passed in a blur of work and quiet contentment. Silver Ridge transformed under a blanket of snow that turned the dusty streets into something almost beautiful, and the Hayes house became a refuge for miners seeking warmth and Clara's hot stew after long shifts in the freezing tunnels below ground. Eleanor learned to bank fires and calculate coal costs and keep pipes from freezing, adding these skills to her growing repertoire of practical knowledge that would have shocked her former Philadelphia self. Reed was attentive, but not smothering, understanding that Eleanor needed her work the way he needed his. They developed a rhythm of mornings together over coffee before he left for the mine and evenings together reviewing the day's events. On Sundays, the only day neither of them worked full shifts, they took long walks through the hills surrounding Silver Ridge, and Reed taught Eleanor to recognize different types of ore and geological formations. She pretended to be interested in the rocks, when really she was just happy to be with him, away from the noise and demands of town. By spring, the Hayes house had expanded again, this time adding a small parlor where boarders could gather in the evenings, and Eleanor had hired a woman named Mrs. Chen, whose husband worked one of the Chinese mining crews, to help with laundry. Mrs. Chen spoke limited English, but she was efficient and kind, and Eleanor found herself learning bits of Cantonese in exchange for teaching English. The cultural exchange seemed to delight Clara, who began incorporating some of Mrs. Chen's cooking techniques into her own recipes, creating fusion dishes that became unexpectedly popular. It was during a busy April evening, while Eleanor was managing the supper service, that James Whitmore appeared in the dining room. She hadn't seen him in months. He'd been spending most of his time in San Francisco, leaving Reed to manage the daily mine operations. Eleanor had been grateful for his absence, though she'd noticed Reed growing increasingly frustrated with his partner's lack of involvement. James looked thinner than she remembered, his face drawn and his eyes shadowed. He stood awkwardly near the door until Eleanor approached, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Whitmore," she said neutrally, "we're serving until 8 if you'd like a table." "I need to speak with you, Mrs. Boone." He corrected himself quickly, color rising in his cheeks. "Privately, if possible." Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, but curiosity won out. She led him to the small office she shared with Clara, closing the door behind them. "What do you want?" James turned his hat in his hands, a gesture that reminded her painfully of Reed. "I owe you an apology. A real one, not the hollow excuses I gave you last year." Eleanor crossed her arms, waiting. She wouldn't make this easy for him. "I was a coward," James continued, the words coming quickly as if he'd rehearsed them. "I convinced myself that marrying Sarah was a business decision, the smart choice. Her father's investment saved the mine, and I told myself that was more important than keeping my word to you. But the truth is—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "The truth is, I was scared. You seemed so capable, so independent. I worried you'd see through me, see that I wasn't as successful as I'd claimed, that the mine was struggling. Sarah looked up to me, believed everything I told her. It was easier. Easier to marry someone you could control," Eleanor said quietly. "Someone who wouldn't challenge you or expect you to be better than you were." James flinched but nodded. "Yes, and I've paid for that choice every day since. Sarah's miserable here. She hates Silver Ridge, hates the noise and the dust and the rough people. She wants to go back to San Francisco, but her father won't let her leave me, says it would be shameful, so we're both trapped in a marriage that makes neither of us happy." Eleanor should have felt satisfaction hearing this, some vindication that James's choice had brought him misery. Instead, she just felt tired. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I see you with Reed. I see how you work together, respect each other. I see you've built something real here, something that matters. And I realize—" His voice broke. "I realize I destroyed the best chance I had at that kind of partnership. You would have been an asset, Eleanor. You would have made me better. And I threw that away for money and ego." "Yes, you did," Eleanor said simply. "But James, I need you to understand something. I'm not sorry you married Sarah instead of me, not anymore. If you'd kept your word, I would have married you, and I would have spent my whole life trying to be the wife you needed instead of discovering who I actually am. Your betrayal freed me to become someone I actually like." James looked at her with something like wonder. "You really mean that?" "I do. I was furious with you for months, humiliated, hurt, convinced I'd never recover. But I did recover. I became stronger, and I found a partner who sees me as an equal, not as a solution to his problems." Eleanor moved toward the door. "I accept your apology, James, but I don't need it. I stopped needing anything from you a long time ago. Reed's a lucky man." "Yes, he is. But more importantly, I'm a lucky woman. I have a life I built myself, not one handed to me by a man who wanted a housekeeper, not a wife." Eleanor opened the door. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a business to run." James left looking oddly lighter, as if the apology had been weighing on him. Eleanor returned to the dining room and found Clara watching her with concerned eyes. "Everything all right?" Clara asked quietly. Everything's fine. James wanted to apologize. I accepted. It's done. And it was done, Eleanor realized. The anger and hurt she'd carried had finally dissipated completely, leaving behind only a distant sympathy for the man James might have been if he'd had more courage. She felt nothing for him now, not hatred, not vindication, not even pity, just indifference, and somehow that felt like the truest freedom. That evening, Eleanor told Reed about the encounter. They were in their room, Reed reading mining reports while Eleanor mended a torn tablecloth. When she finished the story, Reed set down his papers and looked at her thoughtfully. How do you feel about it? Honestly, nothing. He's just a man who made a choice that led me here. I should probably thank him, in a way. Reed smiled. You're more generous than I am. I still want to punch him most days. That's because you're protective. It's one of your more endearing qualities. Eleanor set down her mending and moved to sit beside him. Reed, there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about. The mine. James has been absent more than he's been present lately. Is the partnership still working? Reed's expression darkened. Not really. He's been pulling money out faster than we're making it, using it to fund Sarah's lifestyle in San Francisco. And his decisions when he does show up, they're reckless, cutting corners to maximize short-term profits. It's not sustainable. What are you going to do? I've been thinking about buying him out. I have some money saved, and if I take a loan for the rest... He stopped, looking at Eleanor. But that would mean less money for us, for the Hayes house, for any future plans. I can't make that decision alone. Eleanor considered this carefully. The Hayes house was profitable now, consistently bringing in more than they needed to cover expenses. They'd been saving the surplus, building a cushion against lean times. Using that money to buy out James would be risky, but it would also solve the problem of a partner who was actively undermining Reed's work. How much would you need? She asked. Reed named a figure that made Eleanor's eyes widen. It was substantial, but not impossible. If I loan you half of the Hayes house savings, could you make up the difference? Eleanor, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. We're partners, Reed. Your success is my success. And honestly, watching you struggle with James's poor decisions has been painful. If buying him out would give you full control to run the mine properly, it's a good investment. They talked late into the night, weighing risks and possibilities. By morning, they'd made their decision. Reed would approach James with an offer to buy out his share of the mine, using Eleanor's loan combined with money from the bank. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, the kind of leap that could either secure their future or destroy it. James accepted the offer within a week, clearly relieved to have an exit from both the failing partnership and Silver Ridge itself. The paperwork took another month to finalize, but by June, Reed was sole owner of the Silver Ridge Mining Company. He immediately implemented changes: better safety measures, more reasonable production quotas, fair wages that attracted skilled workers away from competing mines. The short-term profits dropped as he'd predicted, but the long-term prospects improved dramatically. Eleanor watched her husband transform into the kind of mine owner she suspected he'd always wanted to be, one who balanced profit with responsibility, who knew every worker by name, who went underground himself regularly to check conditions. It was dangerous work, and she still worried every time he descended into the darkness, but she understood now that this was part of who Reed was. His integrity demanded that he not ask his workers to do anything he wouldn't do himself. Summer brought changes to the Hayes house as well. One of their boarders, Miss Porter, the school teacher, announced plans to marry a local merchant and would be leaving at the end of term. Eleanor and Clara decided to convert her room into a small library and reading room, a space where boarders could relax in the evenings. It was a risk. The room wouldn't generate rental income, but it proved popular beyond their expectations, attracting not just boarders but townspeople who'd never had access to books before. Eleanor found herself ordering volumes from San Francisco, novels and poetry, practical guides to farming and mining, even some children's books that Miss Porter used in her classroom before she left. The library became a gathering place, and more than once Eleanor looked up from her account books to see rough miners sitting quietly with volumes of Shakespeare or agricultural journals, educating themselves in ways their hard-scrabble lives had never previously allowed. It was Thomas Grant who suggested, one evening in August, that Eleanor should expand beyond just lending books. You've got a talent for teaching, Mrs. Boone. The way you explain things make folks feel like they're not stupid for not knowing. Ever think about starting classes? Eleanor hadn't, but the idea took root. She began offering informal lessons in the evenings, basic literacy for minors who'd never learned, arithmetic for those wanting to better manage their earnings, even letter writing for men wanting to correspond with families back east. Reed helped with the mathematics, using mining calculations to make the numbers practical and relevant. Clara taught basic cooking skills to young men living in boarding houses who survived on saloon food and whiskey. The Hayes house evolved from a simple boarding establishment into something closer to a community center, a place where Silver Ridge's residents could better themselves. And Eleanor, who'd arrived in town as an abandoned mail-order bride with nothing but desperation and $12, found herself at the center of something meaningful. She was no longer just surviving. She was contributing, building, making a difference in ways she'd never imagined possible. By the time their first anniversary approached, Eleanor was managing not just the boarding house, but also the lending library, evening classes, and a new venture, a small shop where Mrs. Chen sold traditional Chinese goods that had become popular with the miners. The Hayes house employed 8 people now, and Eleanor was training Clara's niece to take over some of the day-to-day management. "You're building an empire," Reed teased one evening, watching Eleanor review the week's accounts. "Hardly an empire. Just a business that keeps growing because people need what we offer." That's exactly what an empire is. Meeting needs people didn't know they had. Reed pulled her away from her ledgers. "Come on, put those away. It's our anniversary tomorrow, and I have something to show you." He led her outside where a wagon waited in the yard. Eleanor looked at him quizzically. "Where are we going?" "You'll see. Trust me." They drove out of Silver Ridge as the sun was setting, taking a road Eleanor didn't recognize. After about 30 minutes, Reed turned the wagon onto a narrow track that climbed into the foothills. They crested a rise, and Reed pulled the horses to a stop. Below them, a valley opened up, green and fertile, with a creek running through it and a small stand of trees providing shade. It was beautiful in a way Silver Ridge never was, with actual vegetation and water and space. "What is this place?" Eleanor asked. "It's ours. Or it will be, if you want it." Reed helped her down from the wagon. "I bought this land 6 months ago, 200 acres with water rights. I've been thinking, Silver Ridge won't last forever. The silver will run out eventually, maybe in 5 years, maybe in 20. But when it does, we'll need somewhere to go. I thought," he gestured at the valley, "I thought maybe we could build something here. A real home, not just rooms above a business. Maybe a ranch or farmland or whatever you want. A place that's ours." Eleanor walked to the edge of the rise, looking down at the valley with tears in her eyes. This was what security looked like. Not just surviving year to year, but planning for a future beyond the immediate needs. Reed was offering her roots, permanence, the kind of stability she'd never had even in Philadelphia. "When did you start planning this?" she asked. "The day you agreed to marry me. I knew you'd want to keep working, keep building the Hayes house, but I also knew you deserved a place that was just ours. Somewhere we could grow old together, maybe raise a family if—" He stopped, suddenly uncertain. "We've never talked about children." Eleanor turned to face him. "We haven't. Mostly because I didn't think I was ready. After everything with James, starting the business, learning to be married, it felt like too much to consider." She took his hands. "But looking at this valley, thinking about the future, I think I might be ready now. Or at least ready to try." Reed's face lit up with such pure joy that Eleanor felt her own tears spill over. He picked her up and spun her around, both of them laughing, and when he set her down, he kissed her with such tenderness that she felt it all the way to her bones. They stayed in the valley until the stars came out, talking about possibilities. A house positioned to catch the morning sun, with a wide porch for watching sunsets. Gardens for vegetables and flowers. Maybe some cattle or horses. A place where the noise of the stamp mill couldn't reach, where dust didn't coat everything, where they could build a life that extended beyond the boom and bust cycle of mining. "We don't have to move right away," Reed said as they drove back to Silver Ridge. "But knowing it's there, that we have options, that matters to me. And I wanted you to know that I'm planning for our future, together." "I love you," Eleanor said simply. "I don't say it enough, but I do. I love you for this, for everything, for seeing me as a full partner in building our lives. You make it easy to love you. You're the strongest person I know." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder as the wagon rattled along the dark road. Strong. She'd arrived in Silver Ridge broken and desperate, but somehow she'd found strength she didn't know she possessed. Or maybe the strength had always been there, just waiting for circumstances that required it. The anniversary celebration the next day was larger than they'd planned. Somehow word had spread, and the Hayes house filled with people wanting to congratulate them. Miners who'd attended their wedding, boarders past and present, Clara and her friends, even some of the Chinese workers from Mrs. Chen's community bringing traditional good luck gifts. Thomas Grant made a rambling toast about second chances and stubborn women, which made everyone laugh and cheer. Eleanor stood beside her husband, looking around at the crowded room, and felt a profound sense of gratitude. These people, rough miners and struggling families, immigrants and drifters and fortune seekers, they'd become her community. They'd accepted her when she had every reason to hide in shame, supported her business ventures, treated her with respect she'd never received from Philadelphia's supposedly refined society. Late in the evening, when most guests had finally departed, James and Sarah Whitmore appeared in the doorway. Eleanor tensed, but Reed's hand on her back steadied her. They hadn't been invited, but Eleanor supposed they had as much right to be there as anyone. James had once been Reed's partner, and his decision had inadvertently led to all of this. Sarah approached first, and Eleanor was shocked to see how much she'd changed. The delicate, disdainful woman from the dance had been replaced by someone who looked tired and sad, her expensive dress seeming out of place and faintly ridiculous in the Hayes house's practical dining room. "Mrs. Boone," Sarah said quietly, I needed to tell you I'm sorry for everything. James told me the whole story about how he brought you here and then married me instead. It was cruel, and Her voice wavered. "I benefited from that cruelty. I took the life that should have been yours." Eleanor looked at this unhappy woman and felt only compassion. "You didn't take anything from me, Mrs. Whitmore. James made a choice and you trusted him. That's not your fault." "But you lost everything." "I lost nothing that mattered, and I gained—" Eleanor gestured around the room, at the successful business, the community, Reed standing solid beside her. "I gained more than I ever imagined possible. Your marriage to James didn't take my future. It gave me a better one than I would have had." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "You're kind to say that." "I'm not being kind. I'm being honest." Eleanor surprised herself by taking Sarah's hand. "And if I may be honest about something else, you look miserable. If you want to leave James, if you want to go back to San Francisco or anywhere else, you should. Life's too short to spend it in a marriage that makes you unhappy." "My father would never allow it. The scandal? Let there be scandal. Let people talk. In a year, they'll have moved on to the next gossip, but you'll still be living your life, either trapped in unhappiness or free to find something better." Eleanor squeezed her hand. "I spent too long worrying about what people would say, what they would think. It kept me small and scared. Don't make the same mistake." Sarah nodded, wiping her eyes, and moved away. James approached then, shaking Reed's hand awkwardly before turning to Eleanor. "Thank you for what you said to Sarah. She needs to hear it from someone who isn't me." "Are you encouraging her to leave you?" Eleanor asked, surprised. "I'm encouraging her to do what makes her happy. I've done enough damage trying to force things that weren't meant to be." James glanced at Reed. "Your husband runs a better mind than I ever could. And you've built something remarkable here. I may have been the fool who let you go, but at least I'm smart enough now to recognize what I lost." After they left, Clara appeared at Eleanor's elbow. That was unexpectedly mature of James. People can grow, I suppose. Even people who start out cowardly. Eleanor watched through the window as James and Sarah climbed into their carriage. "I hope Sarah finds the courage to choose herself. She deserves that much." "Like you did," Reed said, pulling Eleanor close. "Like I did," Eleanor agreed. The months that followed brought more changes. Sarah Whitmore did leave, quietly returning to San Francisco in October without her husband. The scandal was surprisingly mild. Most people seemed to think she'd been foolish to come to a mining town in the first place. James sold his house and left Silver Ridge entirely, reportedly heading to the Nevada silver fields to try his luck there. Eleanor wished him well and meant it. He'd been the catalyst for her transformation, even if he hadn't intended to be. Winter came again, Eleanor's second in Silver Ridge, and with it came news that made her both nervous and thrilled. She was pregnant. The baby would arrive in early summer, the doctor estimated, and Eleanor found herself divided between excitement and terror. She'd seen women die in childbirth, had lost her own mother to a fever that followed complications. But Reed's solid presence and Clara's experience, Clara had helped deliver dozens of babies in her years in Silver Ridge, calmed her worst fears. The pregnancy didn't slow her down much at first. Eleanor continued managing the Hayes house, teaching evening classes, overseeing the library. But as winter turned to spring and her body grew heavier and more unwieldy, she was forced to delegate more. Clara's niece, Sarah, named long before the other Sarah appeared, proved capable of handling most daily operations. Eleanor focused on planning and accounts, work she could do sitting down. Reed became almost comically protective, hovering and worrying until Eleanor finally threatened to ban him from their rooms if he didn't stop treating her like she was made of glass. But his concern came from love, she knew, from the memory of losing Sarah in childbirth. He'd told her about it finally, one night when she'd asked, how his first wife had seemed fine until suddenly she wasn't, how quickly everything had gone wrong, how helpless he'd felt watching her slip away. "I can't lose you," Reed said, his voice rough with old pain and new fear. "I survived it once, barely. I couldn't do it again." "You won't have to," Eleanor said with more confidence than she felt. "I'm strong, Reed. You've said so yourself. I've survived everything life has thrown at me so far. I'll survive this too." The baby came on a hot June evening, 3 weeks earlier than expected. Eleanor's water broke during supper service, and the controlled chaos that followed would have been funny if it hadn't been so terrifying. Clara cleared the dining room in record time, sent someone running for the doctor, and transformed the space into a makeshift birthing room while Reed paced outside looking like he might be sick. Labor was hard, longer and more painful than Eleanor had braced herself for. There were moments, in the worst of it, when she understood how women died from this, how the pain could simply be too much for a body to endure. But Clara's steady voice guided her through, and the doctor's experienced hands knew what to do when complications arose, and somehow, just as dawn was breaking, Eleanor's daughter entered the world with a cry that sounded outraged at the indignity of birth. "She's perfect," Clara said, tears streaming down her face as she placed the tiny, squalling bundle on Eleanor's chest. "Just perfect." Eleanor looked down at her daughter, impossibly small, impossibly real, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. This tiny person was hers, created from love and partnership and the life she'd built in Silver Ridge. This was possibility made flesh, the future given form. Reed was allowed in finally, and the look on his face when he saw his daughter made Eleanor start crying all over again. He touched the baby's tiny hand with one calloused finger, and when those miniature fingers closed around his, Eleanor watched her strong, stoic husband's face crumple with joy and relief. "She's beautiful," Reed said, his voice cracking, "just like her mother." "She's going to be strong," Eleanor corrected. "Strong and capable, and free to be whoever she wants to be." They named her Sarah, Reed's choice, honoring his first wife while also reclaiming the name from painful associations. Sarah Boone, born in a boarding house in a silver mining town, daughter of a mail-order bride who'd been abandoned and a mine owner who'd learned to lead with integrity. She was, Eleanor thought, the perfect symbol of second chances, of lives rebuilt from ruins. The summer passed in a blur of sleepless nights and constant feeding and the overwhelming responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive. The Hayes house continued operating smoothly thanks to Clara and young Sarah, and Eleanor split her time between baby care and gradually returning to work. She'd thought motherhood might make her less interested in the business, but instead it made her more determined. She was building something her daughter could inherit, creating opportunities that would be there when Sarah was old enough to choose her own path. By autumn, Eleanor had established a new routine that allowed her to manage both baby and business. Sarah proved to be a relatively easy infant, healthy and curious, meeting every milestone early. Reed was a devoted father, spending every evening with his daughter, teaching her nonsense songs and making her laugh with silly faces, Watching them together, Eleanor felt a contentment so profound it sometimes frightened her. This happiness felt fragile, like something that could be snatched away if she wasn't careful. But the years proved her fears unfounded. Silver Ridge continued to prosper, Reed's mine producing steadily under his careful management. The Hayes house expanded again, adding a proper restaurant that attracted travelers passing through on their way to other mining towns. Eleanor's lending library grew into the town's unofficial school for adults, with regular classes in literacy, arithmetic, even basic law and business management. When Sarah turned 3, Eleanor and Reed finally began building on their land in the valley. They kept their rooms at the Hayes house. It was still their primary source of income and Eleanor's passion project, but the ranch house became their retreat, a place where they could escape the noise and chaos of town. They raised cattle and horses, planted gardens, and created a home that felt permanent in a way nothing else ever had. Sarah grew up running between two worlds, the bustling boarding house where she learned to talk to strangers and help in the kitchen, and the quiet ranch where she learned to ride horses and identify plants. She was fearless and clever, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's stubborn chin. Eleanor watched her daughter grow and felt grateful for every scraped knee and muddy dress, every sign that Sarah was being allowed to be fully herself. It was on Sarah's 5th birthday, during a party at the Hayes house attended by what seemed like half of Silver Ridge, that Eleanor found a moment alone with Clara. They stood on the porch, watching Reed chase his daughter around the yard while miners and families laughed and ate cake. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Clara asked. "If James had kept his word? If you'd married him instead of Reed?" Eleanor considered this. "Sometimes, usually when I'm exhausted or Sarah's been particularly difficult or the accounts aren't balancing. In those moments, I think about the life I would have had, probably easier in some ways, certainly more predictable." "Do you regret how things turned out?" "Not for a single second." Eleanor turned to her friend and business partner. "James abandoning me was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to become someone I actually respect, someone who builds things instead of just occupying space in other people's lives. You've built something remarkable here. The Hayes house, the library, the ranch. And that," Clara gestured toward where Reed had hoisted Sarah onto his shoulders, both of them grinning. "That most of all." "We built it," Eleanor corrected. "You and me together. I couldn't have done any of this without you." "Partners?" Clara said, raising her coffee cup in a toast. "Partners," Eleanor echoed. The party continued into the evening, and Eleanor moved through the crowd feeling grateful for every face she recognized, every person who'd become part of her life in Silver Ridge. Thomas Grant, now retired from mining and working as the Hayes house handyman. Mrs. Chen and her family prospering from their shop. The miners who'd protected her in those early days, the families she'd taught to read, the boarders who'd become friends. This was home. Not the place she'd been born, not the place she'd planned to be, but the place where she'd become herself. The place where being abandoned had led to being found. Later, after Sarah was asleep and the last guests had departed, Eleanor and Reed sat together on their porch at the ranch, watching stars emerge over the valley. The air was cool and clear, carrying the scent of hay and horses and the flowers Eleanor had planted that spring. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if James had shown up at the station that day?" Reed asked. "If he'd kept his word and married you?" Eleanor leaned against her husband's solid shoulder. "I'd have been trapped in a mediocre marriage with a man who saw me as a solution to his problems. I'd have spent my whole life trying to be useful instead of learning to be valuable. And I never would have known you, never would have built the Hayes house, never would have had Sarah. So no, I don't wonder about it with any sense of longing." "His loss," Reed said softly. "My gain." Eleanor smiled, remembering that first conversation with Reed when he'd used those exact words. "Our gain. Everything good in my life came from that moment when I had to choose between giving up or fighting for something better. I chose to fight. And I've been winning ever since." They sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd found each other through circumstance and built something lasting through choice. Behind them, through the window, they could see their daughter sleeping peacefully, secure in a world her parents had created from determination and love and the simple refusal to be broken by betrayal. Eleanor thought about the woman she'd been arriving in Silver Ridge, desperate, humiliated, convinced her life was over. That woman would barely recognize the person Eleanor had become, confident, successful, surrounded by people who respected her not for her family name or social connections, but for her character and capabilities. James Whitmore had thought he was discarding something worthless when he married Sarah Cunningham instead of Eleanor Hayes. He'd been catastrophically wrong. He'd discarded a future he wasn't worthy of and given Eleanor the gift of having to save herself. And Eleanor had done exactly that. She'd taken her pain and humiliation and transformed them into strength. She'd built a business from $75 in determination. She'd turned a town's pity into respect. She'd found love with a man who saw her as an equal partner in every sense. Most importantly, she'd discovered that being abandoned wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning of the story she was supposed to be writing all along, one where she was the hero, not the victim, where she saved herself instead of waiting to be saved, where her worth wasn't determined by whether a man chose her, but by the choices she made for herself. The mail-order bride who'd arrived broken at a dusty mining town station had become a successful businesswoman, a devoted wife, a loving mother, and a pillar of her community. She'd built an empire from nothing and raised a daughter who would never doubt her own value because she'd watched her mother claim hers every single day. Years later, when Sarah was grown and running the Hayes house herself, while Eleanor and Reed lived in semi-retirement at the ranch, Eleanor would look back on that day at the station, the worst day of her life at the time, with something approaching gratitude. Because that day had broken her open and allowed her to rebuild herself into someone she was proud to be. James Whitmore's loss had been his own, but Eleanor Hayes Boone's gain had been everything that mattered: self-respect, true partnership, honest work, lasting love, and the knowledge that she was strong enough to survive anything life threw at her. She'd arrived in Silver Ridge with nothing and created everything. That was her real story. Not the abandoned bride, but the woman who refused to stay abandoned. The woman who chose herself first and found that choosing herself made room for everything else worth having. And on quiet evenings, sitting on her porch with Reed's hand in hers and her daughter's laughter drifting through the windows and the life she'd built stretching out around her, Eleanor understood the deepest truth of all. Sometimes the worst betrayal leads to the best life, if you're brave enough to build it yourself.